Beneath the fog-draped streets of Victorian England, behind the polite facades and the glow of gas lamps, there existed another world, one not of elegance or empire, but of quiet despair. It was a world where hunger had an address, where poverty had rules, and where families who entered together rarely walked out whole. The workhouse was not merely a building, it was a machine designed to test the limits of the human spirit, slow, cold, and endlessly efficient. Tonight, we travel back to that time, to understand not just what these places were, but why they existed, and how they quietly dismantled the warmth of family under the guise of reform. So, settle into the stillness, let the history unfold at its own unhurried pace, and allow the past to whisper its lessons, one echo at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. The morning air hung low and heavy over the countryside, a slow-moving veil of mist tinged with the faint scent of coal. Across the damp fields of England, the first light revealed both familiarity and quiet intrusion. Old cottages, stone walls, and the new silhouettes of chimneys rising where trees once stood. For generations, life had followed the rhythm of the seasons, planting, tending, reaping, resting. Each dawn felt like a continuation of the last. But in the early years of the 19th century, that rhythm began to stutter. The hum of machinery, at first distant, was growing louder. Villages that had once depended on the strength of their fields now found themselves dwarfed by mills and forges. In the towns of Lancashire and Yorkshire, brick walls and iron frames marked the landscape like fresh scars on an ancient face. Steam hissed from narrow alleys, black smoke drifted across the low hills, and the soft murmur of wind through crops was replaced by the relentless clatter of looms. Where the call of the rooster once greeted the day, now came the whistle of a factory, sharp and commanding. For centuries, England's poor had survived through a delicate balance of land, labour, and community. Families worked small plots, spinning or weaving in their cottages to supplement meagre harvests. The system was imperfect, but it allowed families to remain together, bound by shared work and proximity. Yet even before the dawn of the great factories, that system was beginning to fracture. The enclosure movement, the fencing of common land that had once been shared by villagers, transformed open meadows into private property. Generations who had relied on these lands to graze animals or gather fuel were suddenly locked out. With every new enclosure act, the poor lost more of their fragile independence. Mechanization brought both marvel and misfortune. The spinning jenny, the power loom, and the steam engine increased productivity beyond imagination. But progress came with displacement. The old putting-out system, merchants delivering raw materials for families to spin and weave in their homes, began to vanish. Machines did the work of dozens, and at a fraction of the cost. The skilled handloom weaver, once respected, became redundant. In the span of a few decades, cottage industries withered. The hearth, once a centre of family economy, grew cold. By 1820, cities like Manchester, Leeds, and Birmingham were expanding faster than the roads that led to them. Rural families, unable to find work, walked miles with their belongings piled in carts, seeking wages in smoky towns. They arrived to find narrow streets, cramped rooms, and air thick with soot. Life in the countryside had been uncertain, but life in the industrial towns was relentless. There was work for men, women, and even children. Long hours in textile mills or iron foundries, for pay that barely kept hunger at bay. The Industrial Revolution promised prosperity for Britain, and for some, it delivered it. Iron masters, factory owners, and merchants thrived, but for the majority, prosperity felt like something observed through glass. The transformation of economy was not matched by transformation of welfare. Old systems of care, church alms, parish relief, neighbourly aid, began to strain under the weight of mass poverty. Before industrialization, local parishes had been responsible for supporting the poor. Through the old poor law, each parish collected taxes and distributed small amounts of money or food to those unable to work. The system was personal, imperfect, and often patronizing, but it kept people within their communities. With the rise of factories and the swelling of towns, the number of those in need outgrew the parish's ability to care for them. Wages dropped, rents climbed, and diseases like cholera and typhus spread through overcrowded tenements. Relief, once a gesture of community, now seemed an unsustainable burden. As agricultural jobs disappeared, unemployment in the countryside soared. The image of the sturdy beggar haunted lawmakers, men who believed that poverty was a moral failing rather than a social consequence. Among the ruling class, a new idea took hold: the poor should not be made comfortable in their poverty. Assistance, they argued, should be difficult to obtain, unpleasant to endure. This belief would shape an entire century of policy. In towns, reformers and magistrates debated how to control the growing cost of poor relief. They studied reports, statistics, and moral arguments. Philosophers and economists, Thomas Malthus among them, warned that easy charity would only encourage population growth and idleness. They urged a system that would make poverty itself a deterrent. To receive aid should be less desirable than the lowest paid labor. The poor should choose work over welfare, or else face the consequences of their dependence. As debates unfolded in London's committees and Parliament's chambers, the human side of industrial poverty deepened quietly. Families fragmented under economic pressure. Fathers left home to find work, sometimes never returning. Mothers took in laundry or worked in the mills, leaving children in the care of older siblings. Infants were abandoned at parish doors or taken to foundling hospitals. The traditional family unit, once central to rural survival, was beginning to disintegrate. It was in this fragile social moment, between progress and dislocation, that the idea of the workhouse emerged as a practical solution. It was not born from cruelty alone, but from the conviction that order could be imposed on the chaos of poverty. Yet behind its architectural walls and administrative rules, it would become something far colder. The workhouse would represent the formalization of separation, the conversion of family into categories, of need into numbers. By the 1830s, the hum of machines had become the background of British life. Trains crossed fields that once defined quiet isolation. Rivers were tamed for power. Cities stretched outward in brick and smoke. The transformation of Britain was irreversible, and beneath the noise of progress, the quiet machinery of social reform was beginning to turn as well. Gears of legislation, committees, and inspectors shaping a new system that would decide who deserved help and who did not. The silent dawn of industrial Britain had not only altered the land, it had redefined what it meant to be poor and what it meant to belong. The parish, once the small universe of the poor, was about to be replaced by a system of calculated compassion. And as the morning smog thickened over England's industrial towns, the old parish bells rang with less certainty, their echoes swallowed by the steady rhythm of machines. The next stage in this story begins there, in the fading reach of the parish, where charity and control would merge into something far more enduring and far more severe. For centuries before the rise of the workhouse, the English poor had looked not to the state but to the parish. The parish was both a spiritual boundary and a social one, the smallest, most intimate division of English life. Within its borders lay the church, the graveyard, and the cluster of cottages that defined belonging. It was here that births were recorded, marriages blessed, and the dead lowered into familiar soil. It was also here that poverty was measured, debated, and when possible relieved. The parish poor laws of Elizabethan times had been born from necessity. In the 16th century, when feudal bonds loosened and the wandering poor multiplied, the state sought to impose order on charity. Local officials, churchwardens and overseers of the poor, were appointed to assess need and distribute relief. Each household within the parish contributed through a poor rate, a small tax designed to support those unable to work. It was a system intended as both compassion and control, reflecting the belief that care for the destitute was a duty, but one that must remain within clear limits. This local form of welfare relied on proximity. Overseers knew the people they helped. They could distinguish between a neighbor fallen on hard times and a stranger deemed idle or undeserving. Help was personal, sometimes patronizing, often moralizing. A loaf of bread, a few coins, a length of cloth, Assistance was rarely enough to lift anyone from poverty, but it kept many from starvation. The relief was modest and conditional. The old, the sick and orphans received small stipends. Widows were offered temporary aid. The able-bodied were expected to find work. When work was unavailable, some parishes maintained poor houses, simple lodgings offering shelter and food in exchange for labor. There was in this early system a lingering sense of community duty. The parish church, with its tower visible for miles, stood as both watchman and guardian. Charity sermons reminded the wealthy of Christian obligation. Vestry meetings balanced accounts and argued over who should receive aid. In smaller rural parishes, gossip and generosity often mingled. The poor were never anonymous, their lives visible to all, yet this intimacy came with scrutiny. To apply for relief was to expose one's misfortune to neighbours, to risk shame as well as sustenance. As England's population grew in the 18th century, the strain began to show. The price of bread rose with the wars against France. Harvests failed in bad years. Soldiers returning from campaigns found themselves jobless. The number of those needing parish aid swelled, and the poor rate climbed accordingly. Landowners complained of the cost. Farmers resented taxes that consumed their profits. The social compact of mutual responsibility began to fray under economic pressure. In the countryside, the Speenham land system of 1795 attempted to patch the failing order. In Berkshire, magistrates declared that parish relief should supplement wages according to the price of bread and the size of a labourer's family. The idea spread quickly, a well-meaning attempt to prevent starvation during times of scarcity. But in practice, it blurred the line between charity and wage subsidy. Employers lowered pay, knowing the parish would make up the difference, and resentment grew among ratepayers who felt they were supporting both the poor and the employer's profits. The parish, once small enough to contain compassion, became an administrative maze. Overseers kept ledgers filled with names and sums, tracking births, illnesses and deaths. As mobility increased, more people crossed parish boundaries seeking work, and disputes erupted over who bore responsibility for them. The Settlement Acts required certificates, proving one's right to relief in a particular parish. Without them, the wandering poor could be removed back to their place of origin. Families uprooted by enclosure or unemployment were forced to return to parishes that no longer had space or will to support them. The moral tone of poverty also changed. In earlier centuries, misfortune had been accepted as part of the human condition, visited by fate or providence. By the late 18th century, influenced by Enlightenment rationalism and early economics, poverty was increasingly seen as a failure of character. Parish officers began to divide applicants into categories: the deserving poor, the elderly, the sick, the orphaned, and the undeserving, the idle, the drunk, the able-bodied who could not find work. Relief for the former was grudging but possible. For the latter, it was offered with humiliation. Almshouses still dotted the landscape. Small stone buildings founded by wealthy patrons in earlier centuries, providing modest comfort for a handful of elderly tenants. They stood as quiet relics of an older charity, but they could not meet the vast new scale of need. As industrial towns expanded, entire families arrived seeking parish aid. Overwhelming systems built for villages. Overseers faced choices that felt impossible: deny relief and risk starvation, or grant it and court bankruptcy. By the early 19th century, voices in Parliament were calling for change. Reports described parishes sinking under debt, ratepayers rebelling, and labourers growing dependent on public support. To many reformers, the parish system appeared outdated, a patchwork of generosity and failure, prone to corruption and inconsistency. Critics argued that local compassion had turned into national weakness. They wanted uniformity, discipline, and deterrence. Yet, for all its faults, the parish had one quiet virtue: it kept families together. Relief, even when small, allowed the poor to remain in their homes. Children could stay with parents, husbands and wives could share hardship beneath the same roof. The aid may have been begrudging, but it was local. That intimacy, the sense that poverty was something seen and known, would not survive the reforms to come. In 1832, a royal commission was appointed to examine the poor laws. its investigators travelled across England, collecting testimonies, visiting parishes, and tallying costs. Their report concluded that the existing system encouraged idleness, burdened ratepayers, and blurred the line between poverty and laziness. They proposed a new model, one that would centralize control and make assistance deliberately unpleasant. The poor, they argued, must never find the state's generosity more appealing than the lowest paid labor. And so, the centuries-old relationship between parish and pauper began to dissolve. The familiar overseers, the church wardens, the local councils that once managed relief would soon be replaced by boards of guardians, inspectors, and administrators. The village church bell, which had marked both prayer and charity, would ring in a new age of bureaucracy. The comfort of community was to be exchanged for the cold efficiency of institutions. As the new poor law loomed on the horizon, the ethos of charity was about to harden into policy. Compassion would be measured in rations, assistance translated into walls and uniforms. The parish that once held together the fragile dignity of the poor would soon give way to the workhouse, a place where help was conditional upon separation, and where family itself became subject to regulation. When Parliament convened in the early 1830s to address the problem of the poor, the mood in London was one of frustration and fatigue. Across England, from Dorset's quiet parishes to Manchester's smoking factories, the old poor law system was collapsing under its own weight. Rates were soaring, labourers were striking, and pamphleteers filled the newspapers with warnings of social decay. To the reformers of the new industrial age, the issue was not one of compassion but of control. The 1832 Royal Commission on the Poor Laws became the pivot upon which centuries of local charity would turn toward national regulation. Its members were not village clerks or men of the cloth. They were economists, politicians, and early bureaucrats schooled in the language of statistics. They spoke not of souls but of costs, not of hunger but of efficiency. They travelled through the shires, interviewing parish officers, and inspecting poor houses, compiling data that would soon be distilled into one of the most consequential documents of the century, the report of the Royal Commission into the operation of the Poor Laws. That report painted a damning portrait. It claimed that England's old system encouraged idleness, improvidence, and early marriage. The commissioners argued that the promise of parish relief had created a moral hazard, that labourers no longer feared poverty, and therefore lacked incentive to work. They framed poverty as a moral failing, not a structural condition born of industrial upheaval or rural displacement. The language was precise, mechanical, and chillingly detached. Among the most influential voices behind the reform was the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham and his disciples, particularly Edwin Chadwick, who served as one of the Commission's driving forces. Bentham's principle of utilitarianism, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, became the moral compass of the new age. Under this logic, the well-being of the many justified the suffering of the few, so long as it promoted discipline and productivity. Charity in this new calculus was dangerous sentimentality. It blurred the natural line between the industrious and the idle. Chadwick believed the system must be re-engineered with the precision of machinery. Relief, he insisted, should only be given under conditions so austere that no able-bodied person would willingly seek it. Thus was born the principle of less eligibility. The idea was simple. The condition of anyone receiving state aid must be worse than that of the lowest paid labourer outside the system. In other words, the workhouse must be deliberately unpleasant, not a refuge but a deterrent. This was not cruelty for its own sake, Chadwick argued, but rational design. He believed that human behaviour could be corrected through incentives, that fear could restore moral order. To him, hunger was not a tragedy to be cured but a motivator to be harnessed. The poor, he wrote, would work harder and marry later, if faced with the grim alternative of institutional life. It was, as critics would later say, the arithmetic of reform, humanity reduced to columns of cost and moral efficiency. In 1834, Parliament passed the Poor Law Amendment Act, reshaping the relationship between government and poverty across England and Wales. The law swept away centuries of parish relief and replaced them with a new centralised system. Over 600 local parishes were grouped into poor law unions. each overseen by a board of guardians, a committee of local ratepayers supervised by the newly established Poor Law Commission in London. The local autonomy that had once allowed charity to be personal and flexible was replaced by distant bureaucracy. Under the new law, outdoor relief, money or food given to the poor while they remained in their homes, was to be abolished for the able-bodied. Instead, all who sought help were to enter workhouses, where conditions were intentionally harsh. Families were to be separated upon entry, husbands, wives and children sent to different wards. Meals were meagre, uniforms rough, and labour monotonous. Every detail of workhouse life was designed to make self-reliance appear preferable. In the eyes of the reformers, this was progress, an orderly system, free from sentiment, that would eliminate what they saw as dependency and fraud. To others, it was a profound betrayal of Christian and communal values. The poet Thomas Carlyle denounced it as the Gospel of Malthus, accusing its architects of treating the poor as if they were numbers, not souls. The economist Thomas Malthus, whose theories of population growth had influenced the reformers, had warned that charity only encouraged the poor to reproduce beyond the means of society to support them. His ideas, though controversial, underpinned the entire law. The moral underpinning of the new system was unmistakable. Poverty was to be punished into extinction. Labourers were told that if they could not feed their families, they had only themselves to blame. The law made no allowance for the realities of industrial Britain, the collapse of cottage industries, the cycles of factory layoffs, the displacement caused by enclosure. The new poor law treated all poverty as personal failure, never as a symptom of economic transformation. Implementation was met with fierce resistance. In the northern manufacturing towns, places like Bradford, Huddersfield and Oldham, riots erupted. Angry crowds gathered outside proposed workhouse sites, chanting against the bastilles of the poor, as they called them. The nickname captured the public mood. Workhouses were seen not as shelters but as prisons for the destitute. Newspapers printed testimonies from paupers, describing separation from spouses and children, hunger rations, and forced labour. Yet to the London commissioners, this reaction was proof of success. If the poor dreaded the workhouse, the deterrent was working. The able-bodied, wrote one official, must never look to the state for sustenance but to their own exertions. Compassion had been converted into a system of fear, a machinery that aimed to maintain social order through humiliation. For administrators, the numbers told a triumphant story. Poor relief expenditures fell dramatically within a decade of the law's enforcement. Ratepayers celebrated the decline in costs. Reformers declared the moral fibre of the nation restored, but beneath the statistics lay quiet suffering, the voices of the forgotten. Children grew up in institutions, mothers wept for infants taken from their arms, and elderly couples who had spent lifetimes together were torn apart at the gates of the workhouse. The Act's logic extended beyond economics. It reflected the Victorian obsession with moral hierarchy, the belief that discipline, thrift and hard work were not just virtues but proofs of worthiness. Poverty offended that hierarchy because it blurred the distinction between virtue and failure. By isolating the poor behind walls, the reformers could preserve the illusion that society was orderly and moral. The workhouse became both symbol and instrument of that illusion. As the 1840s dawned, England stood divided. In the glittering streets of London and Manchester, wealth multiplied. Steam power, railways and commerce transformed the nation into an industrial giant, but in the shadows of progress stood the institutions that guarded its moral arithmetic, the workhouses, their high windows glowing faintly through the fog. Inside, the philosophy of deterrence played out in silence. The endless hum of sewing, the scraping of spoons in tin bowls, the shuffle of boots on stone floors. The Poor Law of 1834 was meant to teach independence, but it instead exposed the nation's deepest contradictions. It showed how progress, measured in profit and policy, could coexist with cruelty, measured in hunger and loss. England had modernized its charity, but at the cost of its humanity. And yet, the architects of reform saw their work as only the beginning. The new system would require buildings, managers, inspectors, and endless regulations to maintain the strict hierarchy of relief. Across the countryside, new structures began to rise. Vast, austere complexes of brick and iron, their chimneys piercing the skyline like monuments to utilitarian order. These would become the living embodiment of the law's cold arithmetic, the physical enclosures of deterrence. And so, as the nation's conscience hardened into stone and mortar, the age of the workhouse began to take shape, its design reflecting not comfort or charity, but calculation. By the time the Poor Law Amendment Act had settled into practice, England's landscape was quietly changing. Across counties and towns, construction began on buildings that did not aspire to beauty or comfort, but to order. These were not homes, nor even hospitals in the familiar sense. They were machines made of brick and rule, their geometry calibrated to the rhythm of policy. The workhouse was to be the visible expression of the new moral code, and its architecture would embody the philosophy of deterrence more vividly than any act of parliament. From above, the typical Victorian workhouse resembled a fortress, square, symmetrical, self-contained. At the centre stood a tall administrative block, flanked by 4 long wings radiating outward to form a cross or a star-shaped plan. This layout, later known as the pavilion plan, was designed for surveillance. From a single vantage point, a master or matron could observe every corridor and courtyard, ensuring that no movement went unseen. Control was not just a function, it was a principle woven into the very fabric of the building. The materials were deliberately austere, local brick, unadorned and soot-stained, pressed into thick walls that denied light and warmth. Windows were narrow and high, placed just above eye level to prevent distraction or conversation. Iron bars were unnecessary. The isolation achieved by design was more effective than any lock. The floors were stone, echoing beneath the shuffle of boots. The air, even in summer, was tinged with dampness and disinfectant, a smell that would become inseparable from institutional life in the 19th century. The architect George Gilbert Scott, later famous for the Midland Grand Hotel at St Pancras, began his career designing workhouses. So did his colleague William Bonathan Moffat. Their partnership, in the 1830s and 1840s, produced dozens of these structures, each one built to a standard plan, approved by the Poor Law Commissioners. The plans were not intended for innovation but for replication. Every line and corridor was dictated by regulation. The commissioners even issued official guidelines, such as the 1835 Model Plan for Workhouses, to ensure that no building might inadvertently invite comfort. Inside, the arrangement was as meticulous as it was merciless. The workhouse population was divided into strict categories: men, women, boys, girls, the elderly and the infirm. Each group occupied a separate wing, connected only through central corridors that met in the administrative core. Families arriving together were separated at once, a husband to the men's ward, a wife to the women's, children divided by age. There were no family rooms, no private spaces, no shared meals. The architecture enforced policy with silent precision, moral reform through physical separation. Central courtyards functioned as exercise yards, divided by high brick walls that prevented one group from seeing another. The sound of footsteps or a distant cough was often the only sign of life beyond one's section. In these yards, the geometry of control reached its peak, isolation as a moral instrument. The commissioners believed such separation would discourage paupers from seeking admission, and in that they were right. Many preferred starvation to entry. The workhouse dining hall was the institution's heart, yet even here, order triumphed over community. Long rows of wooden tables and benches were arranged beneath a high, echoing ceiling. Meals were eaten in silence, overseen by masters or matrons. Conversation was discouraged, laughter forbidden. The menu rarely changed. Bread, gruel, thin soup, perhaps a piece of cheese or a spoonful of suet pudding on special days. The ration was carefully calculated to sustain life, but never comfort. It was sustenance as policy, measured by the ounce and sanctioned by the commissioners in London. Dormitories were vast and impersonal. Iron bedsteads lined the walls in perfect symmetry, each with its allotted distance from the next, a few feet of separation, measured not for comfort, but for discipline. Bedding was coarse, blankets thin. Windows were kept open at night, even in winter. under the belief that fresh air prevented disease and moral corruption alike. The rhythm of institutional life was marked by bells, one for waking, another for work, one for meals, one for lights out. Time itself was regimented, even rest was rationed. The architectural uniformity extended to the chapels and infirmaries. Chapels were plain, without ornamentation or stained glass. The poor law authorities feared decoration might comfort the soul too much, or invite notions of dignity, incompatible with pauperism. Sermons focused on obedience and gratitude, rather than hope. Infirmaries, meanwhile, were stark and overcrowded. The sick slept beside the dying, tended by inmates rather than trained nurses. The architecture of care reflected the same hierarchy as the rest of the workhouse. Even mercy had its limits. Perhaps the most striking feature of these structures was their silence. Visitors frequently remarked upon it. The clatter of utensils, the muffled shuffle of feet, the distant creak of a door, every sound seemed amplified in the absence of voices. Talking was restricted to essential communication. Laughter could be punished. To the reformers, silence meant order. To the inmates, it was a slow erasure of self. Within those walls, individuality dissolved into obedience. The building itself seemed to absorb personality, reducing its inhabitants to function and duty. The architectural historian Simon Bradley later described these buildings as moral machines. They were not built to serve comfort or efficiency in the modern sense, but to embody a philosophy. Every brick testified to a belief that poverty was disorder, and that order could be imposed through space. The walls of a workhouse were not just physical boundaries, they were ideological ones, separating the deserving from the undeserving, the moral from the fallen, the outside world from the shame within. To the surrounding towns, the workhouse stood as both a warning and a reassurance. Its looming presence on the edge of a village or town reminded workers of the consequences of failure. If you will not work, the building seemed to say, here is where you will live. Its clock tower, often the tallest structure in the district, struck the hours like a sermon on self-discipline. The poorhouses of earlier centuries had been embedded within communities. The new workhouses were deliberately placed apart, often on high ground, where they could overlook the towns they served, both visible and apart, like sentinels of moral order. In many places, these buildings still stand today, their shapes softened by time, but their symmetry unmistakable. Some became hospitals, others administrative offices or housing developments. Yet even now, when one walks the long corridors or stands in the central courtyard, one can feel the residue of regulation, a faint echo of measured footsteps, the cold geometry of reform still imprinted in the air. For the inmates who lived there, architecture was not abstract design, it was experience. The building governed their every movement, dictated their silence, and erased their sense of belonging. Within those walls, poverty was not merely endured, it was performed under constant supervision. The discipline of the workhouse began not with words or laws, but with bricks and light, and as the years passed, those walls witnessed another transformation, the quiet dissolution of families. The architecture that promised efficiency would soon reveal its deepest cruelty, the systematic separation of husbands, wives, and children who entered together, never to live as a family again. The wind moved softly through the narrow lane that led to the workhouse gates, carrying with it the faint smell of coal smoke and damp earth. A family approached, a father with the posture of someone long acquainted with disappointment, a mother clutching the edges of her shawl around two children. Their shoes were worn through at the soles, each step pressing mud into the cracks of the stones. Around them, the world seemed to hold its breath. No one spoke, even the church bell, which usually tolled the noon hour, seemed muted by the low sky. They had walked for miles. Behind them lay the remnants of their home, a rented room whose rent had gone unpaid, a few possessions left behind for want of carrying. Before them stood the workhouse, tall gates of iron, painted black, opening onto a courtyard enclosed by high brick walls. Smoke rose steadily from chimneys that looked like watchtowers. There was no sign of welcome, no sound of life beyond the faint creak of a door somewhere inside. The building was less a place than a presence, one that had waited for them, silently, as it waited for all who ran out of options. The father paused at the entrance. His name was not yet written in the ledgers, but already he had been categorized by the law. able-bodied, unemployed, destitute. His wife, thin and pale, held their youngest close to her chest. The older child, a boy of about 7, stared at the iron gate, as if it might open into another world. He had heard stories from other children, of uniforms, of gruel, of separation, though he could not yet imagine what that meant. A man in a long coat appeared from the doorway. He was the porter, a sort of gatekeeper to the institution. His expression was neither cruel nor kind, simply professional, as though compassion had been drained out of him by years of repetition. He asked their names, their parish, their ages, and their circumstances. Each answer was recorded in a ledger by another man seated at a small desk just inside the entrance. The ink moved slowly across the page, black against brown paper, forming letters that seemed permanent. They were told to wait in the receiving room. It was small and bare, with benches along the walls, and a single window high above. The air smelled of disinfectant and cold stone. On the wall, a notice displayed the regulations. No inmate shall leave without permission. Silence shall be maintained during meals. All are to attend divine service. The words were written in large type, as if to ensure they were understood by all who entered, though for many the act of reading was itself a reminder of difference. After a time, the relieving officer arrived to conduct the formal admission. He was responsible for determining whether applicants were truly destitute, and whether they should be granted entry. The process was bureaucratic but ritualistic, a slow stripping away of identity. Questions were asked. Had they sought employment? Did they own property? Could any relatives provide support? The father answered truthfully, though each reply seemed to push them further into inevitability. Finally, the officer nodded, wrote a note of approval, and handed it to the porter. The moment of decision passed without ceremony. There was no sympathy, no gesture of comfort. The gate closed behind them with a low, resonant clang, not loud, but final. Inside, the family stood together for what would be the last time in that form. A matron entered, holding a small ledger of her own. Her voice was quiet but certain. Men this way, women and children to the left. At first they hesitated. The boy clung to his father's leg. The mother whispered something to the matron, her voice trembling. But rules were rules, and sympathy had no place within them. The porter gestured toward the men's yard, and the father, understanding that resistance would only shame them further, knelt to meet his son's eyes. He said nothing, for there was nothing to say. He stood, handed the boy to his mother, and walked through the doorway marked men. The door closed behind him with the soft finality of habit. The separation was immediate and absolute. From that moment, the family ceased to exist as a unit. The husband became an inmate of the men's ward. The wife and children became part of the women's. They would not share meals, nor see each other, except perhaps at chapel on Sundays, when the sexes were divided by a central partition. Even then, only a fleeting glance across the aisle would remind them that they once belonged together. The admission process continued with quiet efficiency. The mother and her children were led to the women's bathroom, where each new arrival was required to wash. The water was cold, the soap coarse. Their clothing was taken away, placed in a heap to be disinfected or burned, depending on its condition. In its place they were given institutional garments, rough wool, dyed a dull shade of grey or brown. The garments were identical for all, a uniform of poverty designed to erase individuality. The boy's hair was cropped short, as was every child's upon arrival. The youngest, still barely walking, whimpered as a matron examined her for lice. The mother stood motionless, clutching the child's small hand, her own hair damp and tangled. She had been told the rules: obedience, silence, punctuality. Any breach would be punished, by confinement, by reduced rations, by loss of privileges. But privileges in the workhouse were few, and hope was not among them. In another part of the building, the father was undergoing the same ritual. His clothes were taken, his body searched for vermin, his name entered into a new register. He was given a coarse shirt, trousers, and boots that did not fit. His bed space was assigned in the men's dormitory, a long, cold hall where 50 iron bedsteads stood in rows beneath high windows. The sound of coughing echoed through the air. On the wall, Another notice. Industry is the duty of all. When supper was served, a thin stew, a slice of bread, he ate in silence among strangers. Across the courtyard, in another hall, his wife and children were doing the same. The rhythm of the institution enveloped them quickly, as if it had been waiting all along. For the administrators, this process represented efficiency, the successful functioning of a system designed to distinguish the deserving from the undeserving. The separation of families was not seen as cruelty, but as moral hygiene. By dividing men and women, the poor law guardians believed they were preventing idleness, dependency, and immorality. Family bonds, they argued, were dangerous within an institution where duty must outweigh affection, but for those who lived through it, the moment at the gate marked the beginning of a quiet unraveling. The memory of home, however humble, began to fade beneath the sound of bells and footsteps, replaced by the monotony of routine. Children grew accustomed to their wards, to the taste of gruel, to the silence of discipline. Parents learned to lower their eyes, to suppress questions, to wait. Night fell early in the workhouse. As the last light slipped through the narrow windows, the mother lay awake on her cot, listening to the sound of the child breathing beside her. Somewhere beyond the walls, her husband did the same. The distance between them was only a few yards, yet it might as well have been miles. In the stillness, the architecture's purpose revealed itself once more to divide not only bodies but spirits, and so began their life inside the system, measured not in days or hours, but in routines and silences, in the slow adjustment to an existence defined by regulation rather than relationship. For every family that entered, the workhouse did the same work, not only feeding and housing, but erasing the past. And as the lamps dimmed in the courtyards, and the gates closed for the night, the machinery of routine prepared to take hold. Morning came not with sunlight, but with the clang of a bell. The sound echoed through corridors and stairwells, rebounding from brick and iron, until it became part of the building's pulse. The workhouse did not wake so much as it resumed. Every hour had its assigned meaning. Every movement had been rehearsed before by countless others. For those newly admitted, the day began in confusion, the dull disorientation of waking in a place that did not remember their names. In the men's ward, boots struck stone in rhythm as the inmates rose from their beds. The air was heavy with the smell of limewash and damp wool. The supervisor walked the row, checking each bed for neatness, each man for compliance. No one spoke unless addressed. A cough here, a sneeze there, the only signs of life in a hall of obedience. Outside, frost lingered on the windows, thin and delicate like lace, though no one paused to admire it. The bell demanded movement. Across the courtyard, in another wing, the women's ward stirred to the same sound. Mothers gathered their children, smoothing their coarse blankets and buttoning the stiff collars of their uniforms. Infants were carried to the nursery. Older girls stood in lines, eyes lowered, awaiting instruction. The matron entered with her keys jingling softly at her waist, a faint metallic music that followed her everywhere. To the inmates, it was a constant reminder. Authority had a sound, and it was the turning of locks. The family that had arrived the day before was already unrecognizable to itself. The father, whose hands had once worked the fields, was now listed in the labor book as a braker, assigned to crush stones in the yard for hours each day. The mother was assigned to the laundry, where steam rose in heavy clouds and the air was thick with lye and heat. The boy was sent to the children's ward for instruction and light work. His younger sister remained in the nursery among the infants. They would not meet again except by accident, and even then, contact was discouraged. The division of labor was the heart of the institution. Each category of inmate was to contribute to its maintenance. Men performed the hardest manual tasks: stone breaking, oakum picking, or field labor. The oakum, strands of old ship rope, had to be unpicked and cleaned for reuse, a tedious and finger-bruising task meant to occupy hours without purpose. Women worked in the laundry or kitchen, scrubbing, boiling, mending. Older girls helped with sewing uniforms or cleaning wards. Even the elderly and infirm were given small tasks, such as peeling potatoes or sorting rags. In the workhouse, idleness was a sin. Labor was both punishment and proof of worthiness. Each job was performed under supervision. The workhouse master kept a ledger of hours and productivity. Though there were no wages to record, payment came only in the form of continued sustenance. A bowl of gruel, a bed, a place to exist. The inmates were taught to see labor, not as livelihood, but as moral duty. To work was to repent, to rest was to regress. The poor law commissioners had insisted that the industrious spirit could only be cultivated by constant occupation, and so every minute was accounted for. In the laundry, the sound of work filled the air, the hiss of boiling water, the slap of wet cloth, the scrape of brushes against boards. The women stood in rows beside long vats, their faces reddened by steam. Conversation was forbidden except for functional commands. Soap, rinse, next. The matron moved among them with her ring of keys, inspecting progress. Each key unlocked some part of the building: supply cupboards, storerooms, dormitories, and the clinking sound followed her like a refrain. To those inside, it was the only melody the institution allowed. Meanwhile, the children's ward was a world apart. Boys were taught simple arithmetic and scripture, their lessons punctuated by chores. They swept corridors, carried coal, helped in the kitchen. Girls learned sewing, mending, and domestic service. The system was not designed for education in the modern sense, but for training, to prepare them for a lifetime of servitude or labor outside the walls. Discipline began early, and affection was discouraged. The older children were warned not to comfort the younger ones. Even kindness was a form of disobedience if it interrupted order. For the administrators, this separation was a triumph of organization. They spoke of the workhouse as a model of efficiency, a place where chaos was transformed into discipline, where dependence became industry. Yet to those who lived within it, the effect was different. The silence between sections, the absence of familiar faces, the monotony of tasks, all of it combined into a kind of stillness that felt endless. The days did not pass so much as blend together, indistinguishable, except by the ringing of the bells. The architecture amplified this silence. Each ward was isolated by locked doors and long corridors that absorbed sound. The walls were thick, the windows high. Communication between sections was impossible, except through staff, and even they rarely lingered. The courtyard, surrounded by these walls, became the only open space, yet even there, groups were segregated. Men marched in circles during their allotted exercise hour. Women walked in theirs, eyes downcast. The children were permitted to play under supervision, though play meant quiet movement and little laughter. To new arrivals, the soundscape of the workhouse was unforgettable. The clang of the gate closing behind them, the rhythm of boots in the corridors, the scrape of wooden bowls on the tables, the occasional cry of a child muffled by distance. But above all, it was the sound of keys, turning, locking, unlocking, that defined existence within. Each door, each cupboard, each gate required a key, and each key represented authority. Inmates could move only where permitted, only when accompanied. Freedom was measured not in distance but in permission. There were moments when silence seemed to carry weight, pressing against the walls. During meals, the stillness was broken only by the scrape of spoons. During chapel, only the voice of the chaplain filled the air, speaking of submission and gratitude. Even prayer became mechanical. Words recited by rote, drained of their meaning by repetition. At night, the final bell sounded, and the doors were locked one by one. The last echo of the turning key signaled the end of the day's routine, and with it came a kind of uneasy peace. It is difficult now to imagine the emotional geometry of such a place. To those outside, the workhouse was simply an institution, a solution to poverty, but to those inside, it was an architecture of separation that divided not just families but the idea of family itself. The mother in the laundry might glimpse her son across the courtyard during transfer, yet be forbidden to speak. The father might hear, faintly, the sound of children's voices during Sunday hymns, but never know which belonged to his own. The system had no room for sentiment. Compassion, like privacy, had been replaced by regulation. Over time, the new inmates adapted to the rhythm. They rose, worked, ate, slept. the cycle repeating until memory itself began to dull. The pain of separation faded, not because it healed, but because the mind, like the body, learned to survive within limits. The poor law reformers had achieved what they intended. Poverty transformed into order, dependence into submission. The family that had once arrived together now existed as entries in separate registers, bound only by the sound of the same bell that governed them all. In the quiet hours before dawn, the building rested again, vast, still, unfeeling. Outside, frost gathered on the iron gate. Inside, the last light of the watchman's lantern flickered across the walls as he passed. He paused to check each lock, each latch, ensuring everything was secure. The sound of keys, soft, metallic, inevitable, moved through the darkness once more, marking the boundary between control and the faint dream of freedom. And when the first pale light touched the high windows, the machinery of routine began again, precise, mechanical, and indifferent. When the bell rang for the morning assembly, the workhouse did not stir with life so much as unfold according to plan. Rows of men filed into one hall, women into another, children into a third, all guided by warders who carried ledgers and spoke in tones of practiced restraint. There were no names spoken aloud, no greetings, no acknowledgement of individuality. Each person had become an entry, a category, a number. The workhouse was, above all else, a structure of administration, and within its registers, individuality was a complication. Upon admission, each new arrival surrendered not only their belongings but their names. They were recorded under the parish rolls, assigned a unique number, and issued a uniform that marked them as inmates. This was not accidental. It was a design of the system itself, to remove distinction, to reduce disorder to arithmetic, to replace the unpredictable human being with something legible, measurable, and controlled. The uniforms were coarse. Men wore rough wool jackets of drab grey or brown, with trousers of unbleached fabric and heavy boots that chafed against the skin. Women's dresses were of similar cloth, long and shapeless, with aprons that grew stiff with use. Children's clothes were cut down from old uniforms, patched and repatched until the fabric no longer had a thread of softness left in it. Everything was identical, and in that sameness lay the first lesson. The workhouse had no favourites, and comfort was not among its offerings. Inmates arriving from the outside world often arrived in clothes that still carried the marks of their former lives: a tradesman's jacket, a mother's shawl, a child's cap, knitted by hand. These items were the last remnants of identity. At the gate, they were exchanged for the workhouse issue. The personal garments were taken, sometimes fumigated and stored, often destroyed. The act was procedural, but its impact lingered. Stripped of the familiar, the new inmates stepped into a version of themselves that existed only within these walls. Each garment had a number stitched inside, denoting the ward or the section to which it belonged. The system was efficient, nearly military. Clothing was collected, washed, redistributed, and tracked through ledgers that documented every change. If an inmate grew ill, their uniform was marked accordingly. If they died, it was cleaned and reissued. Nothing was wasted. Not fabric, not labour, not even the impression of a life once attached to it. The use of numbers, too, was more than convenience. It was a philosophy of governance. The Poor Law Commissioners had envisioned the workhouse as an institution of moral accounting, where every person could be tallied, every meal recorded, every hour measured. The idea of the pauper number embodied this. The individual reduced to data, to an entry on a line. Names carried memory, history and emotion, things the workhouse could not afford. Numbers, by contrast, were neutral, obedient, unfeeling. During roll calls, the overseers would read from the registers in monotone. Numbers, not people. Responses were expected to be quiet, mechanical acknowledgements. A misplaced number or an incorrect response invited reprimand. For the elderly or the illiterate, it was often confusing, a cruel abstraction to navigate. Yet the staff were trained to see accuracy as discipline, and discipline as salvation. The system's success was measured not in human contentment, but in statistical order. Inside the laundry, steam rose over a row of women in matching grey, The air smelled of soap and fatigue. At one end of the hall, a matron's voice cut through the hum of work. 78, step forward. A woman obeyed without hesitation. Her name had not been spoken in months. For many, the sound of their given name had become foreign, almost forbidden. In the children's ward, the same transformation occurred early. Teachers addressed their pupils by number, and the children, eager for approval, learned to respond quickly. Over time, the habit became instinct. This stripping of identity was not seen by reformers as cruelty, but as virtue. They believed poverty bred indiscipline, and that humility could only grow from the erasure of pride. Uniforms and numbers symbolized moral equality. All were poor, all were dependent, and therefore all were the same. To treat them differently would, in the logic of the time, reintroduce the corruption of preference. Yet in the sameness, individuality eroded. The workhouse achieved its ideal of equality only by denying personhood. The impact extended beyond the walls. In the surrounding towns, the stigma of the workhouse number followed those who left. Discharged inmates were sometimes recognized by their worn uniforms, or the cropped hair that marked their stay. Employers hesitated to hire them. Neighbors whispered. The number, even when discarded, lingered in memory, a label that outlived its utility. For administrators, these numbers made the system governable. Each ledger recorded admissions, deaths, discharges, punishments, and meals served. From these books, the commissioners in London compiled reports for Parliament, each line of data representing a life reduced to statistics. The reports spoke of efficiency, improvement, reduction in dependency. They did not speak of faces or voices. The human stories existed only between the lines, invisible, inaudible. In some workhouses, attempts were made to soften the effect. Chaplains urged staff to call inmates by name during services. Some masters allowed names on official forms, but these gestures were exceptions, fragile and easily reversed. Bureaucracy, once established, resisted sentiment. Numbers were easier to track than people, and the machine of governance demanded precision. At night, when the lamps were dimmed, the uniforms hung neatly on pegs beside the narrow beds. Rows of identical garments, lined like shadows, gave the dormitories a strange symmetry. The smell of coarse cloth mingled with the faint odor of soap and cold air. In the half-light, it was difficult to distinguish one figure from another. They all breathed in rhythm, a quiet collective sound that seemed to belong more to the building than to the individuals within it. Somewhere in the men's ward, a man might still remember the feel of his old coat, the one that carried the scent of his fields, the texture of soil ground into its seams. A woman might dream of her shawl, now long gone, woven by her mother's hand. A child, half asleep, might whisper a name, their own or someone else's, before the silence reclaimed it. These small rebellions of memory were fleeting, yet they were all that remained of identity, in a place designed to erase it. By dawn the bell would ring again, and the numbers would rise once more. Each would put on the same coarse garment, take the same place in the same line, and resume the same anonymous motion. To the outside world, this was order. To those within, it was an endless rehearsal for obedience, a performance in which individuality had no role, and so the rhythm continued, steady and unbroken, until the meaning of self was replaced entirely by the ritual of belonging to the institution. The uniform was no longer merely clothing, it was a declaration of status. The number was no longer merely a record, it was a name rewritten in the language of control. Together they created a silence that was not empty, but full of the weight of all that had been surrendered. And as the next bell sounded across the courtyard, summoning them to their assigned labors, the machinery of routine began to hum once more, precise, efficient, and indifferent to the faces it governed. The first sound of morning in the workhouse was not birdsong, nor footsteps, nor the stir of voices. It was the bell, a single metallic toll drifting through the corridors, striking stone and iron, summoning everybody within earshot to wakefulness. It was not loud, not urgent, merely inevitable. It rang at the same time each day, regardless of weather, season or circumstance. In its tone there was no compassion, no variation. It was the sound of order, asserting itself over the fragile human rhythm of sleep. Those who had spent any time inside knew its meaning instinctively. The bell was not simply a signal, it was a boundary between rest and duty, a reminder that each moment within the institution was owned, divided, and measured. The Poor Law Commissioners, in drafting the workhouse regulations, had imagined this sound as a kind of moral instrument, a device to shape behavior and discipline through time itself. In this they succeeded. The bell became the clock of the poor. Men rose first, their boots scraping the floors in a slow collective rhythm. Then women, stirring from rows of narrow beds, folding their coarse blankets into perfect rectangles. In the children's ward, the older ones helped the younger dress, fastening buttons and smoothing collars, whispering instructions that they were not supposed to give. The day began not with talk but with motion, a silent choreography practiced endlessly. Within the first half hour, the next bell rang. This one signaled assembly and inspection. The men lined up in the labor yard, hands by their sides, eyes forward. The master or his assistant walked down the line with a ledger, marking attendance, recording any absences or infirmities. Across the courtyard, women assembled in the laundry hall, where the matron's ring of keys chimed faintly as she checked uniforms and posture. Every sound, from the turning of a page to the echo of a footstep, seemed amplified by the emptiness of the place. Breakfast followed, another bell, another signal. Meals were served in silence. Gruel for most, sometimes bread, occasionally a thin broth, if supplies allowed. The benches were hard, the bowls tin, the portions identical. There was no conversation permitted during meals. Only the scrape of spoons and the occasional cough broke the monotony. For those who had once known the conviviality of a kitchen table, this silence carried a strange ache, a memory of something intimate that now felt impossibly distant. After breakfast, the next bell sounded. Work began. The day divided itself into segments marked by sound. Men went to the yard for stone breaking or oakum picking, where they worked in rows beneath an open sky that felt less like freedom and more like exposure. The rhythmic strike of hammers blended with the faint ringing of the distant church clock. Two kinds of timekeeping, one spiritual, one bureaucratic. Inside, the women moved to their assigned tasks: laundry, sewing, scrubbing. The air in these rooms shimmered with steam and fatigue. In the nursery, children's voices murmured softly, a subdued imitation of play, supervised by attendants who spoke little. Every few hours, another bell marked transition. Work to meals, meals to prayers, prayers to inspection. The system was exacting, but it was not cruel by accident. Its purpose was deterrence, to make life within the workhouse so relentlessly structured that idleness would seem a sin, and poverty, a personal failing to be redeemed through labor. In this way, time itself became an instrument of moral correction. The bell divided the day into portions of endurance. Its predictability offered no comfort, only the dull assurance that tomorrow would be identical. Over weeks and months the inmate's sense of personal time dissolved, seasons lost meaning, birthdays went unmarked, days of the week blended together. There was only the bell, impartial, regular, absolute. Visitors, on rare occasions, noted this strange stillness. A local official inspecting the wards might remark upon the cleanliness, the order, the lack of noise. Everything appeared efficient, peaceful even, but beneath that quiet lay a profound fatigue, not of body, but of spirit. The discipline that governed the workhouse was not enforced by violence, but by repetition. The sound of the bell did not command obedience through fear, but through inevitability. When evening came, the rhythm reversed. Work ceased, meals were served again, prayers read aloud in the chapel. The chaplain's voice, solemn and low, echoed against the cold walls. He spoke of patience, humility, and the virtue of endurance. Many listened without comprehension, some without belief, but all remained still. The same stillness persisted through the night, interrupted only by the distant chime of the town clock outside, a faint reminder that another world continued beyond the walls. The bell rang once more to signal curfew. Doors were locked, keys turned, the wards settled into silence. Those who could not sleep lay listening to the faint hum of wind through the windows, the occasional cough, the shuffling of a restless body nearby. The day had been lived not through choice, but through schedule. In that predictability, something numbing took root, a quiet acceptance that resistance was useless, that even thought should move in rhythm with the bell. For the children who grew up inside, the sound became as familiar as breathing. Many could not remember a world without it. When they were eventually sent out into apprenticeships or domestic service, some found the absence of the bell unsettling, the freedom to choose when to eat, when to rest, almost disorienting. Time outside was too vast, too unregulated. The workhouse, in its cold precision, had become the only world they understood. The reformers, reading reports from across the country, celebrated this order. They pointed to the reduction in outdoor relief, fewer paupers relying on parish charity, fewer demands upon the rates. They saw efficiency, structure, and moral progress. But what they measured was obedience, not well-being. The people within the walls were quieter, yes, but their silence was not gratitude, it was resignation, a slow surrender to monotony that dulled even the memory of freedom. By late evening, as the final embers in the furnace dimmed, and the halls fell into shadow, the bell hung silent once more. It waited for morning, when the ritual would begin again. In that silence, there was no peace, only suspension. The building seemed to breathe faintly, as if resting between mechanical cycles. The inmates, half asleep, half aware, lay in rows, their dreams interrupted by habit. Even in sleep, they waited for the next sound. And somewhere beyond the walls, in the streets of the parish, the church clock struck the hour. It was a different kind of bell, slower, warmer, resonant. Its sound drifted faintly through the air, touching the outskirts of the workhouse grounds before fading into the fog. Those inside never heard it clearly. Their world was ruled by another bell, colder, smaller, endlessly consistent, a voice of the institution that spoke not to the soul, but to the schedule. And so, with each passing day, the sound continued, not merely marking time, but shaping it. The bell became the master of every motion, the rhythm of every breath, until the idea of life beyond it began to dissolve entirely. The day began and ended with its toll. Everything between was repetition. And when the morning bell returned, as it always did, the routine resumed, quiet, precise, and indifferent, as though time itself belonged not to the people within, but to the walls that held them. When the bell sounded for meals, the workhouse moved as one. No words, no laughter, no hurry, just a silent migration through corridors and across the courtyard toward the dining hall, where the smell of boiled oats and stale bread drifted faintly through the cold morning air. The gruel was thin, more grey than white, and served from heavy tin vats that steamed beneath the flicker of gaslight. The bowls, dented and dull, waited in orderly rows upon the long wooden tables. Food, in the logic of the poor law, was not nourishment. It was policy. It existed not to comfort but to deter. The framers of the 1834 amendment had insisted that the conditions of relief must be less eligible than those of the lowest paid labourer outside, meaning that no one should prefer the workhouse to work. Hunger, therefore, was an instrument of governance. The diet was carefully calculated to sustain life, but never pleasure. Breakfast was served at dawn, and it rarely changed gruel, perhaps a small piece of bread. Occasionally, a spoonful of molasses was added for children or the infirm, though such kindnesses were exceptions. The gruel itself, a mixture of oatmeal, water, and salt, was boiled in large copper cauldrons, stirred by inmates assigned to kitchen duty under supervision. If cooked too long, it thickened into paste, too short, and the oats floated half raw. Either way, it was tepid by the time it reached the tables. In silence they ate. The overseer stood at the end of the hall, ledger in hand, eyes sweeping across the room. Talking was prohibited during meals. Discipline was to be maintained even in the act of eating. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons, the shifting of benches, and the occasional clang of a bowl against the table's edge. For newcomers, the stillness was unnerving. For those long accustomed, it was simply the way of things, a ritual stripped of all human warmth. Lunchtime brought variety only in form, not in comfort. The midday meal, the largest of the day, might consist of boiled potatoes, suet pudding, or broth with fragments of meat too small to name. The ingredients were weighed according to regulation. An adult male might receive 8 ounces of bread and a pint of soup. A woman, slightly less. Children, less still. Everything was recorded, portioned, and justified in the ledgers that governed the house. Food, like everything else, was administered through arithmetic. The meat, when it appeared, was of the cheapest cut, often salted beyond taste to prevent spoilage. Vegetables were boiled until all texture disappeared, their color leached into the cloudy water that passed for broth. The bread was coarse, made from low-grade flour, its crusts hard enough to last days. Yet it was food, and to the destitute outside the gate, those sleeping in barns or under bridges, it represented survival. In this way, the workhouse achieved its cruel equilibrium, enough to live, not enough to envy. At the end of each meal, the inmates stood for inspection. Bowls and spoons were checked, counted, and stacked. No one was permitted to leave until dismissed. In some houses, the remnants of food were collected and reused for animal feed. In others, they were disposed of under watchful eyes. Theft, even of crumbs, was punished. To be caught concealing a crust of bread might result in hours of solitary confinement or the loss of the next meal. Hunger was never an excuse. It was an expected condition. The rules governing meals were exhaustive. The Poor Law Commissioners had outlined them in official directives distributed across England and Wales: fixed meal times, portion control, prohibition of talking, segregation by gender and age. No man might dine beside his wife, no mother beside her child. The family unit, already fractured by admission, was further divided by the act of eating. Meals, which once bound people together in daily life, now served as reminders of isolation. To the administrators, this rigidity was a form of moral training. They argued that the poor must learn self-control, gratitude, and humility. To eat without complaint, to labor without rest, to endure without rebellion. These were signs of virtue. The workhouse diet, therefore, was both literal and symbolic sustenance. It fed the body minimally, while feeding the ideology of discipline completely. Inspectors' reports from the period reveal the consequences. Some describe inmates fainting at work from hunger. Others tell of children sneaking scraps from the refuse heap. Occasionally, reformers visiting the wards would be shocked by the rations and write petitions for improvement. Yet most of these appeals were dismissed as sentimentality. Outdoor charity breeds idleness, one commissioner wrote, and indulgent feeding weakens the moral fiber. Within such logic, compassion became inefficiency. Even on Sundays, the supposed day of rest, the diet remained austere. After chapel, a slightly thicker broth might be served, sometimes accompanied by suet pudding for the elderly or the sick. These small deviations were considered acts of mercy, though they were scarcely enough to change the monotony of flavor. Hunger was the constant companion of the workhouse inmate, lingering just beneath the surface of survival. The kitchens themselves were places of contradiction. They smelled of heat and metal, of broth and ash, of effort without reward. The cooks, usually female inmates, worked long hours stirring vast pots and cleaning the soot-blackened walls. They labored in proximity to food but without appetite, surrounded by sustenance that belonged to the system, not to them. Above the doorways, small notices reminded them of their duty: waste not, want not. The irony was inescapable. Dinner, taken in the late afternoon, marked the final meal of the day. After that, there would be no food until morning. Hunger deepened through the night, sometimes interrupted by dreams of old kitchens, warm bread, or harvest feasts long past. The bell that summoned them to eat, and the bell that dismissed them from the table, became twin markers of endurance, permission and denial woven into the same daily ritual. Children, too, learned this rhythm early. They were fed first, under supervision. their portions slightly sweetened or softened, but even their meals were designed for discipline. They ate in rows, backs straight, eyes down. Any laughter or noise drew reprimand. The idea was to shape their behavior before hunger shaped their character, to produce obedient adults, not contented ones. And yet, despite every rule, every restriction, a quiet defiance persisted. A mother might slip her child an extra piece of bread. A worker in the kitchen might ladle an extra spoon of gruel for the weakest inmate when no one was watching. These acts of small mercy passed unnoticed in official records, yet they were the only warmth that survived within the cold arithmetic of rations. By evening, when the lamps dimmed and the corridors emptied, the smell of the day's cooking lingered faintly in the air, a thin reminder of sustenance that had already vanished. In the silence that followed, stomachs tightened and minds dulled. The next bell, hours away, would bring the same meal again, the same motions, the same absence of taste. In this cycle, appetite ceased to be hunger alone, it became memory. Each mouthful carried the ghost of what had been lost, the warmth of family tables, the comfort of choice, the simple act of eating freely. The workhouse fed the body, but in doing so, it starved the soul of every association that once made food human. And when the bell finally tolled for morning, summoning them once more to the dining hall, they moved toward it without expectation, only the quiet understanding that the day would begin again exactly as it had before, under the watchful eyes of the master, where food was not a gift, but a rule. When the morning bell echoed through the courtyard, it woke not only the weary adults but also the children, small forms stirring under coarse blankets, their faces pale in the thin dawn light. The workhouse nursery, a long echoing hall divided by age and gender, smelled faintly of soap and damp linen. Rows of iron bedsteads stretched endlessly, each one identical, each one a small island of regulation. The children rose when told, washed when ordered, ate when permitted. In the workhouse, childhood was less a stage of life than a category of management. They had arrived through many doors, some carried by their mothers, others by parish officers, others simply found wandering. Orphanhood was not always biological, it was administrative. When families were divided at the gate, a child might become orphaned by decree, not by death. Paperwork replaced parenthood, names were recorded in ledgers, ages approximated, and siblings often assigned to different wards. The records rarely noted the crying that followed, or the silence that came after. In the ideology of the Victorian workhouse, children represented both the burden and the hope of reform. They were to be rescued from the moral contagion of poverty, yet trained to remain poor enough to labour without complaint. The 1834 Poor Law Commissioners described this mission with bureaucratic calm. Children shall be educated in habits of industry, obedience and restraint. Compassion was not mentioned. The daily rhythm of their lives reflected this doctrine. At dawn they assembled in the schoolroom, a plain space with whitewashed walls, a blackboard, and rows of wooden benches. The air was heavy with chalk dust, and the faint odour of boiled clothing from the laundry beyond. The lessons were mechanical: reading, writing, arithmetic, and scripture. The goal was not knowledge but conformity. They copied passages from the Bible, memorized moral maxims, and learned to spell the words that defined their condition: labor, duty, thrift. Teachers, often older inmates or poorly paid schoolmasters, enforced silence as discipline. A talking child was made to stand, sometimes for hours. Errors in spelling or arithmetic invited reprimand, never encouragement. The education of the poor was not designed to elevate, it was meant to contain, as one inspector wrote in 1842. Instruction shall be sufficient to fit the child for the position Providence has assigned him. Providence, in this context, meant labor. Beyond the classroom, the older children worked. Boys were assigned to the fields, the workshops, or the stables, girls to the laundry, the kitchens, or the sewing rooms. Their hands learned the motions of adulthood early, stirring vats, scrubbing floors, folding linen, and their minds adjusted to the monotony. Work was both punishment and preparation. Each task, however small, was part of the larger machinery that kept the institution running. The workhouse taught the poor to sustain the system that confined them. Yet there were moments when the illusion of childhood flickered faintly. In the small yard designated for exercise, some children kicked at pebbles or traced patterns in the dust. A few whispered stories remembered from before, fragments of mothers' songs, village games, or tales of green fields far away. But such moments dissolved quickly when the matron's voice called them back inside. Play was tolerated only as discipline in disguise, marching in circles, standing in lines, following commands. Spontaneity was disorder, and disorder was sin. The youngest children, those still too small to work or study, spent their days in the nursery under constant supervision. They learned early that crying brought no comfort. The attendants were overworked, often indifferent, bound by rules that discouraged affection. To lift a child unnecessarily, to hold one too long, was to invite reprimand for sentimentality. And so, the children learned a quieter form of survival, how to rock themselves to sleep, how to speak in whispers, how to forget the faces that once kissed them goodbye at the gate. As they grew, these children absorbed the institution into their bones. The sound of keys became normal, the scrape of the meal bell ordinary. The concept of family blurred into the structure of authority. The master and matron were not parents but permanent presences, figures of discipline rather than love. They did not punish cruelty, they maintained order. To the children, this distinction became the measure of adulthood. In records from the mid-19th century, visitors to workhouse schools often remarked on the striking quietness of the pupils. They sat, they listened, they obeyed. Few smiled, their voices when heard, were soft and formal, as though they feared being overheard by the walls themselves. These were children raised without play, without property, without the possibility of disobedience. Their innocence had been replaced by compliance, an innocence of a different kind. Some inspectors praised the efficiency of such order. They saw in the workhouse child a model of future citizenship, punctual, obedient, industrious. Yet reformers like Charles Dickens and Lord Shaftesbury saw something else, a generation trained to mistake endurance for virtue. Dickens, visiting such institutions, later wrote of little creatures who have never been young. The tragedy was not only in their hunger, but in the absence of memory. They would grow up remembering nothing soft. When these children left the workhouse, usually at 13 or 14, they were apprenticed to farms, factories, or domestic service. The system congratulated itself. Dependency had been cured through labor. But for the children, departure was only another kind of confinement. The same obedience, now without even the company of others who understood. They entered the world without family, without education beyond the barest literacy, and without the habit of choice. There were exceptions, of course. Some children, adopted by reformers or taken under the wing of sympathetic staff, escaped the full weight of the institution. Others ran away and vanished into the anonymity of the cities. Yet, the majority remained within the invisible boundaries of the class they had been born to, the deserving poor, trained to deserve little. The workhouse school system continued into the late Victorian period, gradually evolving as public opinion shifted. The Education Act of 1870 and later reforms slowly drew children out of the workhouses and into public schools. But by then, generations had grown under the old regime. They had learned to speak without emotion, to eat without taste, to dream without hope. The institution had succeeded in producing exactly what it intended, not despairing children, but compliant adults. At night, when the lamps dimmed and the corridors fell silent, the children's ward became a landscape of faint breathing and muffled coughs. In the half-light, one could see small forms turning restlessly, their hands curled against coarse blankets. Sometimes, a murmur would escape, a name, a fragment of memory, the echo of a mother's voice. But such sounds faded quickly into the rhythm of the place, where even longing seemed to move in measured time, and when morning came again, with its familiar bell, they rose without resistance. The day would begin as all others had: work, lessons, silence, food, inspection. They were children of the house, born into its walls, raised by its rules, and shaped by its absence of tenderness. Their world was orderly, predictable, and airless. In time, they forgot that life had ever been otherwise. The workhouse did not simply shelter them, it defined them. It gave them numbers, uniforms, tasks, and scriptures, everything except the sense of belonging that makes a childhood whole. They grew up in a world that taught them to call no one mother, to look for kindness not in faces but in routine. And so, when they left, they carried the institution within them, quietly, like a shadow that stretched across the rest of their lives. Morning came to the women's ward in a haze of steam. Long before the light reached the high windows, the laundry was already alive with motion. Buckets sloshing, irons hissing, the dull thud of linen against wooden boards. Here, among the smells of soap and damp cloth, women labored through hours that seemed to dissolve into one another. The laundry was both the heart and the exile of the workhouse, always busy, always hidden. For many, it was where they had been sent as soon as they arrived. Mothers, widows, seamstresses, all reduced to the same grey uniform and the same endless task. The Poor Law Commissioners had intended the laundry to serve as indoor industry, a way to keep women employed and the institution self-sufficient. But in practice, it became a place of both discipline and displacement. Rows of large copper boilers lined one wall, their contents bubbling like cauldrons. Women stirred them with long wooden paddles, lifting and lowering heavy bundles of linen until their arms ached. The air was thick and wet, the walls glistening with condensation. On cold mornings, the steam froze into beads on the windows. On warm ones it hung so densely that faces blurred into ghostly outlines. The noise was constant, water sloshing, iron scraping, the creak of wringers turning. The laundry was divided by order and hierarchy. At one end, women sorted soiled sheets and uniforms brought from the infirmary and the dormitories. At the other, cleaner fabrics were rinsed, wrung, and hung to dry in the yard. Everything moved according to routine. Each woman had her position and her rhythm. They spoke little, partly because the noise drowned conversation, partly because silence was safer. The matron, or sometimes her assistant, patrolled between the rows, clipboard in hand, ensuring that the rules were followed. No idleness, no talking, no sitting unless instructed. For the older women, those whose hands were already lined with age and labor, the work was endurance. For the younger ones, it was penance. Many had entered the workhouse pregnant, or with infants in their arms, sent away from parish relief or from the shame of illegitimacy. The Victorian world had little tolerance for women who bore children outside marriage. In the official language of the period, they were fallen, and the laundry was where the system sought to wash them clean. The irony was cruel. In scrubbing linen for the house, they were also scrubbing at the stain of their own existence, as if soap and repetition could remove both dirt and disgrace. Their children, taken to the nursery upon entry, grew up in the same building but lived as strangers. Mothers glimpsed them sometimes across the yard. A familiar face, a hand raised in recognition quickly stilled by the overseer's glare. There were no visiting hours, no embraces, no shared meals. The laundry became the mother's world, and the child's absence its echo. The conditions were harsh, but the monotony could be strangely protective. The rhythm of washing, wringing, and folding dulled thought. The mind, numbed by repetition, learned to drift between the motions. Grief softened into fatigue, and fatigue into habit. For some, this was survival, to think too deeply about what had been lost. A home, a husband, a name, was to risk despair. The laundry, with its heat and its rhythm, offered a kind of anesthetic. Accidents were common. Burns from boiling water, crushed fingers from mangles, and fainting from heat or exhaustion appeared frequently in the records. The medical officer might note such incidents briefly. Woman scalded, fit for work again in 2 days, as if the body were merely another piece of equipment to be repaired and returned. Complaints of illness were often dismissed as malingering. In a world where poverty was viewed as moral weakness, pain was interpreted as insubordination, and yet the laundry had its own strange community. Within the silence, bonds formed quietly, a shared glance, a murmured word when the matron turned her back, a piece of bread smuggled from the kitchen. Older women guided the younger ones, teaching them how to manage the labor, how to hide small kindnesses, how to endure. Some found solace in the physicality of the work itself, in the steam that blurred the edges of the world, in the rhythm that gave shape to otherwise shapeless days. Inmates were permitted one short break in the middle of the day, when they sat together on benches outside the laundry's rear door. The air there smelled of soap and smoke. Some women took off their caps to feel the faint breeze, others simply closed their eyes. It was during these brief pauses that fragments of their old selves surfaced, memories of kitchens, fields, laughter. A few spoke softly of children they hoped to see again once released. Most did not speak at all. The sound of the bell when it came ended the reverie. The laundry's output was essential to the workhouse economy. It washed for the institution itself, and sometimes for neighboring parishes, bringing in small profits. Administrators praised its efficiency. In reports to the Poor Law Board, they described the women's labor as steady, satisfactory, and reformatory. The phrase concealed the reality that their reformation meant nothing more than exhaustion without rebellion. Religious instruction accompanied the work. Bible verses were painted on the walls. "Cleanse thou me from secret faults. The wages of sin is death." The matron read from scripture on Sundays, her voice echoing through the steam. To many the words blended into the hiss of the boilers, their meaning lost in the endless cycle of washing. Religion in the laundry was not comfort. It was justification. It sanctified suffering by calling it moral improvement. But beneath the surface of this moral machinery, fragments of resistance endured. Women hid tiny tokens, a lock of hair, a child's ribbon, a scrap of paper, in the folds of laundry bundles or under their mattresses. Some carved initials into the wooden tables, as if to prove that they had once existed beyond their number. Such gestures carried no hope of change, yet they were acts of quiet remembrance, defying the institution's demand for erasure. When night came, the laundry fell silent at last. The steam cooled, the fires dimmed, and the women returned to their wards. The smell of soap lingered on their skin, their hair damp from hours of heat. They lay on narrow beds beneath coarse blankets, hands raw and throbbing. For a few moments before sleep, they might imagine other worlds, kitchens where they once sang, children's laughter carried through open windows. But the images dissolved quickly into the grey of exhaustion. In the darkness, the building seemed to breathe, pipes creaking, water dripping, the distant echo of footsteps in another corridor. Tomorrow would bring the same routine, the same vats, the same smell, the same endless cleansing. Time in the laundry did not pass. It accumulated, like the layers of steam upon the walls. Days became indistinguishable, memories bleached as clean as the sheets they washed. For the women, the laundry was more than a workplace. It was a space between punishment and refuge, a place where they could lose themselves in labor, and for a few hours forget the weight of separation. It was where grief became mechanical, and sorrow found its rhythm in the turning of wringers and the folding of linen. The laundry was their sentence, but it was also their shelter from thought. And so they worked on, day after day, the air thick with steam and penitence. Their hands shaped the fabric of the institution itself, unseen and unthanked. And in the rhythm of their labor, the washing, the wringing, the folding, the quiet heartbeat of the workhouse continued. Morning arrived with a dull metallic chill in the men's ward. Before the first light crept across the courtyard walls, the bell had already sounded. The men rose from narrow wooden bedsteads, their bodies heavy with the weight of unending repetition. The smell of lime and cold stone drifted faintly through the open windows. Another day of labor waited beyond the gate. Another day in the yard. The stone yard was the male equivalent of the laundry, though stripped of warmth and enclosed by walls too high to see over. Here, under the supervision of the master, or a paid foreman, men worked at tasks designed less for productivity than for punishment. Their labor was deterrent labor, work without purpose, effort without outcome. They broke stones. The stones were carted in from nearby quarries, or from roads being repaved by local authorities. Large blocks, grey and unyielding, were dumped in piles at the center of the yard. Each man was assigned a hammer, a chisel, and a quota. The stones were to be reduced to uniform fragments, small enough to fill the ruts of distant roads. The work had no meaning beyond obedience. When a man entered the yard for the first time, he was shown how to strike. Full swing, pause, full swing again. The rhythm was meant to exhaust, not to build. The sound carried across the courtyard, like the slow pulse of the institution itself. Hammer against rock, again and again until the distinction between muscle and will dissolved. The task had been designed with intention. Reformers and poor law administrators of the 1830s believed that idleness was the root of poverty. The cure, therefore, was unceasing motion. Labour, however pointless, was the moral medicine. Breaking stones, picking oakum, turning cranks. These were the rituals of penance for the sin of destitution. The men worked in silence. Conversation was forbidden, laughter inconceivable. They bent over their tasks, faces blank, hands blistered. The foreman walked slowly between them, measuring progress, not in productivity but in compliance. If a man slowed, the foreman's voice reminded him. Keep to it. If he faltered, there was no sympathy, only a note in the ledger, a deduction in rations, a threat of solitary confinement. The air in the yard was filled with dust. It clung to skin, to clothing, to the inside of lungs. By midday, every face was grey, every movement mechanical. Some men tied rags around their mouths to keep from breathing the fine powder. Others worked bare-chested under the weak sun, sweat cutting pale lines through the grime. The sound of hammers never stopped. It was the soundtrack of punishment, not for a crime, but for poverty itself. For the older men, many of whom had once been labourers, the stone yard was a cruel parody of the work they had known. They remembered building walls, roads, houses, things that lasted, that carried purpose. Here the product of their effort was destruction. Stones that might once have built were now broken to dust. Dignity fractured alongside the rock. Each strike of the hammer was an admission that their strength no longer belonged to them. Those too weak for the stones were sent to pick oakum, another form of deterrent labour. Oakum was old rope, tarred and hardened, used in shipyards to caulk wooden vessels. In the workhouse, it arrived in filthy bundles. The men sat in long rows, prying the fibres apart with their fingers until their nails bled. The task was monotonous, painful, and slow. Like the stones, it produced nothing of value. The purpose was not output, but obedience. Records from the mid-19th century describe these labours with clinical precision. The Poor Law Board measured work in task units, so many stones per day, so many ounces of oakum per week. Failure to meet the quota could result in reduced meals, loss of privileges, or confinement. Inspectors wrote approvingly of such systems, noting that they maintain industrious habits and discourage idleness. Yet they rarely mentioned the toll, the hands too swollen to close, the coughs that deepened with each passing winter. And still, the men endured. For some, endurance became the last assertion of self. They worked not out of belief in reform, but because to stop was to surrender entirely. The rhythm of the hammer was a kind of heartbeat, slow, steady, indifferent. The sound filled the void where pride once lived. During brief pauses, they leaned on their tools and stared at the walls. Above them, the sky appeared as a narrow strip of pale grey. Birds sometimes crossed it, indifferent to the order below. In those moments, the men were reminded of fields and open roads, of seasons once measured by the growth of crops rather than the sound of a bell. The memory hurt, so they turned back to the work. Memory in the stone yard was a dangerous luxury. At midday, they rested for a short meal. Bread, soup, silence. They sat on the ground or against the cold wall, bowls balanced on their knees. Conversation, if it occurred, was whispered. Some spoke of families outside, others of places once known. Most said nothing. Then the bell rang again, and the hammers resumed their patient rhythm. By afternoon, fatigue dulled even thought. The muscles worked by habit, the mind detached. Some men found a strange calm in the repetition, as though the act of breaking stone dissolved not just rock but memory. Others felt only the slow erosion of will, the sense that the yard itself was grinding them into smaller and smaller fragments, like the stones they shattered. When the sun dipped behind the wall, the foreman signaled the end of work. The tools were collected, counted, and locked away. The men filed back through the narrow gate into the main building, their boots leaving pale trails of dust along the corridor floors. The yard emptied, but the sound seemed to linger, a phantom rhythm echoing through the air, fading only as the evening bell tolled. Inside, the men washed in cold water, the dust turning to streaks of grey on their arms. Some coughed softly, others simply stared at their hands. It was said that, over time, the skin hardened into callus thick enough to dull sensation. Pain became a constant hum, neither sharp nor bearable, simply there. In the quiet after supper, they sat on wooden benches, eyes lowered, waiting for lights out. Conversation returned in small fragments. Someone might mention a harvest long past, a child they once carried on their shoulders, a wife now working in the laundry on the other side of the yard. But such talk faded quickly. To speak of the world beyond the gate was to remember what could not be reclaimed. Night came softly, bringing with it the slow settling of dust. The yard lay empty, its stones piled in mute geometry beneath the moonlight. The day's labor left no trace, no progress, no reward, only exhaustion, and the faint echo of hammers in the air. In the philosophy of the poor law, this was success. Poverty had been disciplined, idleness had been punished, order had been maintained. The stone yard, like the laundry, stood as proof that even suffering could be systematized. And when morning returned, as it always did, the men rose again at the sound of the bell. They took up their hammers, their chisels, their quiet despair. Each blow split not just stone, but self, the slow fracture of dignity measured, day by day, in dust. Silence had always been the workhouse's truest discipline. Long before dawn, before the first bowl of gruel, or the first toll of the bell, silence filled every corridor, every dormitory, every ward. It was not the silence of rest, nor the peace of contemplation, but something more deliberate, a rule, an order, a mechanism. It wrapped itself around the walls like a second kind of mortar, binding obedience to stillness. The workhouse, as conceived under the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, was not built to punish crime but to reform character. Its silence was moral in design, meant to cultivate humility through suppression. Talking, especially idle talk, was viewed by administrators as a threat to discipline, an invitation to complaint, rebellion, or memory. Speech connected people. Silence kept them separate, and separation, to the reformers, was purity. In nearly every workhouse record, the rule of silence appears. It governed meal times, work sessions, marches between rooms, and the long hours of evening when the inmates sat in rows, waiting for the bell that would release them to bed. Some houses permitted brief conversation during exercise, others forbade even that. Each union had its own interpretation, but the intention was uniform: the poor should be quiet. The master and matron enforced this without sentiment. Their authority was a kind of still gravity. If a whisper was heard in the dining hall, the offender might lose a meal, or be ordered to stand in a corner until the others finished. A louder breach, a laugh, a cry, a shout, might bring a harsher penalty, confinement, or the withdrawal of tobacco, or a day of solitary work. Over time, the inmates learned that silence was safer than speech, and safety became its own habit. In the men's wards, this silence had a particular texture. It was filled with the rhythm of mechanical sound, the striking of hammers, the rattle of stones, the scrape of tools. Beneath these noises, human voices vanished, replaced by the ordered percussion of labor. In the women's wings, the silence was softer but heavier, mixed with the sighing of steam and the constant turning of wet fabric in tubs. When the bell rang for meals, footsteps replaced speech. Wooden shoes clattered across stone floors, a sound so consistent that even it began to feel choreographed. Meals were taken in long refectories, bare halls with benches and wooden tables. Each person sat in assigned order, their bowls placed at equal distances, their portions measured precisely. Before the first spoon touched the thin soup, the master might call for a moment of prayer, delivered not as comfort, but as regulation. Then, silence resumed. The scraping of spoons, the swallow of bread, the occasional cough. These were the only sounds allowed. The air was thick with the restraint of hundreds of people forced to pretend they were alone. To the poor law commissioners in London, silence represented moral virtue. They believed that talk encouraged mischief, that conversation bred dissatisfaction. A quiet workhouse, they wrote, was a well-regulated establishment. Inspectors visiting from the capital noted this approvingly in their reports. How the inmates maintained good order, how the meals proceeded without disturbance, how the children performed their lessons with becoming decorum. Yet beneath these phrases lay the invisible cost, the erasure of humanity's most basic comfort, the ability to speak, to share, to be heard. Children felt it most sharply. They learned early that curiosity must be stifled, that laughter drew punishment, that questions were dangerous. In some workhouses, the schoolmaster spoke of silent learning, lessons conducted by gesture, repetition, and writing rather than speech. The clatter of slates replaced the sound of voices. Even in play, noise was discouraged. A shout, a song, a cry of delight could bring the matron's glance, or worse, the cane. Slowly the children learned to move quietly, to smile without sound, to think in whispers that never reached their lips. Over months and years this imposed quiet became part of the atmosphere, absorbed into the bricks. Visitors often remarked on it. Clergymen sent to preach described entering halls where hundreds of faces turned toward them without expression, their eyes dull, their hands motionless. Journalists who toured these institutions in the 1840s and 1850s called them sepulchral, places that resembled tombs more than homes. Even Charles Dickens, when he visited and later wrote Oliver Twist, could not help but draw upon that uncanny stillness, that unnatural order, where sound seemed almost sacrilegious. And yet there were sounds that persisted, faint, private rebellions. The shuffle of feet after lights out, the whisper of women exchanging words through cracks in the laundry wall, the low hum of a lullaby in the nursery, sung under the breath so as not to draw attention. These were the quiet resistances of the poor, small acts of humanity preserved in miniature. To speak was to risk punishment. To remain silent was to lose oneself entirely. Between those choices, people found narrow corridors of compromise. For the masters, silence was power. Their footsteps echoed differently, loud, confident, deliberate. When they entered a room, the atmosphere tightened. Conversation stopped even before they appeared. They did not need to shout. Authority was a sound of its own. Orders were brief, functional, and final. The matron's voice, when heard, was often the only female sound permitted to carry through the halls. Her tone was clipped, her words chosen carefully to maintain distance. Compassion, if it existed, was muted. The architecture supported this control. High ceilings amplified every stray sound, making even a whisper seem loud. Corridors turned sharply, preventing sightlines and reducing the chance for private talk. Windows were placed high on the walls to let in light but not view. Every design decision reminded the inmates that speech belonged to authority, not to them. As months became years, silence did its work. It reshaped posture, slowed gestures, erased expression. People learned to communicate in subtler ways. A glance, a nod, a touch of the sleeve. In a system that valued stillness over solidarity, even the smallest act of recognition became radical. Yet those moments were fleeting. Most days passed like unbroken hours, measured only by the toll of bells and the scraping of bowls. There were, occasionally, breaches. A man would shout in frustration, a woman would cry out in grief. Such sounds echoed through the building with shocking force, cutting through the calm like cracks in glass. They were met swiftly. The master's reprimand, confinement, silence restored. But in the rare seconds between the outburst and its suppression, the sound seemed to awaken something in the others. Heads turned, eyes met. For a heartbeat, they remembered they were still alive. Historians studying workhouse life often note that silence was not simply absence but architecture, a form of social engineering. It reduced individuality, limited dissent, and turned the workhouse into a machine of moral correction. It also left almost no trace. Diaries were rare. Conversations went unrecorded. The silence of the poor became the silence of history itself. And so, in the quiet after the day's labour, when the lamps burned low and the air settled heavy over the wards, the inmates lay still, men, women, and children, their thoughts muted, their dreams wordless. The night watch passed through the corridors, keys jingling softly, footsteps measured and slow. No one spoke. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, whispering through the cracks, carrying with it a sound the workhouse had almost forgotten, the faint murmur of the living world beyond. In that world, people spoke freely. They laughed, argued, called to one another across fields and alleys. But inside these walls, the rule of silence held. It was both punishment and peace, both cruelty and calm. It muffled rebellion, but also memory. It was the quiet that defined everything else, the stillness from which all other suffering began. Sunday came quietly, as every other day did in the workhouse. The difference was only in the sound. For 6 days the rhythm of the bell measured labour, dawn, meal, work, rest. But on the 7th, it marked something more deliberate, ritual. The morning bell rang slower, deeper, as if to remind the inmates that even devotion had its schedule. There was no excitement in the air, no hum of anticipation. Instead, there was a subdued orderliness, a kind of practiced stillness that came from years of repetition. Sunday was the day of sanctioned noise, hymns aloud, prayers required, words spoken, but only those approved. In the logic of the workhouse, religion existed not to liberate the soul, but to discipline it. Faith was permitted, as long as it reinforced obedience. Hope, on the other hand, was something dangerous, something that suggested the possibility of life beyond the walls. In the earliest years after the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, the law required every workhouse to provide religious instruction. The commissioners, guided by the moral tone of Victorian society, believed that poverty was as much a spiritual failure as an economic one. Therefore, salvation had to be offered, but under supervision. Each union appointed a chaplain, usually a clergyman of the Church of England, whose duty was to conduct Sunday services, visit the sick, and provide moral guidance. Attendance was compulsory. At the sound of the bell, the inmates assembled, men first, then women, then children, each group led by an attendant and kept separate even in worship. They filed through narrow corridors toward the chapel, their wooden shoes striking softly against the stone floors. The line moved without conversation. Only the faint rustle of coarse uniforms filled the air. The chapel stood at the center of the complex, not grand but symmetrical, its design as functional as the dormitories or the laundry. The chapel was often cold. The walls were bare, painted in dull shades of grey or cream. Light filtered weakly through tall, arched windows, their glass clear rather than coloured. Benches were arranged in long, straight rows, each one identical to the next. The altar stood at one end beneath a wooden cross, plain and unadorned. There were no candles except during winter, when the dim mornings required them. The smell of damp wood and old stone mixed with the faint scent of iron from the men's tools, stored nearby during the service. The chaplain entered through a side door, his black robe brushing the floor. He did not smile. His role was not to comfort, but to instruct. To him the congregation was not a flock seeking redemption, but a lesson in morality, proof that discipline could save souls as well as bodies. He began with a prayer for order, for gratitude, for acceptance of divine will. The inmates bowed their heads, though few listened closely. They had heard the same words every week, their meaning long since worn smooth by repetition. When the hymns began, the silence of the week was briefly broken. The voices rose hesitantly, unevenly, as if unsure how to sound after so much restraint. Some sang out of habit, some out of faint belief, others simply because it was required. The hymns were chosen carefully, verses of endurance, patience, submission. All things bright and beautiful might have been too cheerful. Abide with me was more suitable. The sound filled the cold space, echoing off stone walls, thinning as it rose. In some houses, a small harmonium accompanied the singing. its wheezing tone marking each note with a mechanical precision. To outsiders, the Sunday service might have appeared a moment of grace. The poor gathered in shared devotion, the echo of hymns rising like prayers. But to those within, it was another kind of labor. The act of standing, sitting, kneeling, rising, all choreographed, all measured, became another task to complete, another proof of obedience. Even faith had its schedule. The chaplain's sermon followed, and with it the slow unfolding of moral instruction. The themes were predictable: thrift, humility, gratitude, restraint, poverty, he reminded them, was a trial sent by God to test virtue. Suffering was purifying, to complain was to sin. Heaven was promised, but only to those who bore their earthly burden with silence. Liberation was postponed indefinitely, deferred to an afterlife that felt impossibly far away. Some listened, most did not. They sat with bowed heads, eyes fixed on the floorboards, minds wandering beyond the walls. The rhythm of the words became like the sound of the bell, something constant, predictable, and strangely hypnotic. The chaplain's voice echoed through the room, a steady cadence that dulled thought. Even disbelief became quiet under its weight. Children were made to sit at the front, their small bodies lined up in neat rows, faces pale under the morning light. They fidgeted, eyes flicking toward the windows, where the outside world existed in soft, unreachable motion. Trees bending in the wind, a bird passing, a sliver of sky. The matron's gaze kept them still. Later, they would return to their schoolrooms for religious instruction, memorizing verses about obedience and patience. Scripture lessons were less about salvation than about shaping behavior. To be good was to be silent. To be humble was to be safe. For the women, the service carried a quieter sorrow. The hymns of endurance felt personal, echoing their own domestic servitude. The chaplain's admonitions about duty and virtue sounded not unlike the words once spoken by employers or husbands. Religion, once a source of solace, had been reduced to another discipline. Still, some found brief comfort in the ritual, in the familiarity of sound, in the faint warmth of voices rising together, however controlled. For a few moments, the stillness softened. When the service ended, the order of return was the same as the arrival: children first, women next, men last. The line moved back through the corridors, the sound of footsteps fading into the hum of the building. The rest of the day unfolded slowly. Sunday was nominally a day of rest, but rest in the workhouse was not freedom. The inmates were expected to remain in their wards, reading approved tracts or sitting quietly. Some were given religious pamphlets, others simply stared into space. Visitors, local parishioners or guardians, sometimes attended the services. They would remark on the orderly behavior of the inmates, the commendable decorum, the spirit of humility. Few noticed the absence of joy. In reports to the Poor Law Board, chaplains often spoke of spiritual progress, of the poor learning to accept their lot. But the letters written years later by those who escaped tell a different story, of sermons that sounded like sentences, of hymns that became indistinguishable from labor songs, of faith that survived despite the workhouse, not because of it. By evening, the chapel stood empty again. The air was still cold, still damp. The benches bore the faint impressions of hundreds of bodies now gone. Dust drifted in the shafts of fading light. Outside, the bell rang once more, not for prayer, but for supper. The brief allowance of words had ended. Silence returned, filling the space like water returning to a vessel. In the philosophy of the poor law, religion had done its work. The souls of the poor had been instructed in endurance, their tongues disciplined by hymns of submission. Faith remained, but hope had been carefully measured, rationed like bread. And as night fell once again over the stone yard and the dormitories, the last echoes of song faded into the same quiet that defined every other day. The poor had prayed, as they had been told to. They had sung softly, bowed properly, endured faithfully, and in the end, the workhouse slept, devout, obedient and utterly still. In the dim light of the workhouse office, order reigned. Here, away from the steam of the laundry and the grit of the stone yard, the air was still, the walls lined with shelves of bound ledgers. Dust rose faintly from the spines when the clerks pulled one free. Volumes heavy with the slow weight of lives recorded, numbered and forgotten. The ink was always black, the paper always pale, and the handwriting impossibly precise. This was the other rhythm of the workhouse, the rhythm of pen against paper, of names transformed into entries, of existence turned into data. Every workhouse by law was required to keep its records with scrupulous detail. The Poor Law Commissioners demanded it. From the 1830s onward, bureaucratic oversight became the quiet engine of the system. The guardians of each union were to submit reports, the masters to record attendance, the matrons to list rations and berths. Each death was noted, each punishment described, each discharge dated and signed. Order was the only virtue the system never failed to achieve. The record book was the soul of this order. In it, human lives became columns and rows. One line for admission, another for departure, a space for cause and condition. Sometimes there were brief notes in the margins. Destitute, ill, insane, pregnant, deceased. No elaboration, no story, just enough to complete the form. On quiet evenings, the clerk sat beneath a single oil lamp, its glow catching the curve of his pen. Outside, the dormitories murmured faintly with sleep. Inside, the only sound was the slow scratching of nib on paper. Each stroke was deliberate, each curve of a letter identical to the last. It was a kind of artistry, this precision, the beauty of bureaucracy, perfected through repetition. The handwriting itself was a relic of discipline. Clerks were trained to write with elegance, their penmanship, the visual echo of moral order. The pages of the record books, now held in archives, still bear that uniform grace, inked lines that have not faded with time. They list names in alphabetical rows: Mary Ann, Thomas, Sarah, Henry, Ellen, dates beside each, numbers beside those. A note of entry or removal, lives reduced to data points so carefully written, they almost appear loved. Yet behind each line was a story. Behind admitted January 12th, 1847, might lie a winter of hunger, the death of a father, a mother's long walk through snow to the workhouse gate. Behind discharged April 4th, 1848, might lie a burial in the pauper's field, unmarked and unrecorded beyond this page. The book was impartial, it did not care what came before or after. Its beauty was its detachment. Every morning the clerk would receive the day's reports. The matron sent lists of meals distributed, clothing repaired, infants born or buried. The master submitted records of punishment: 2 hours confinement for insolence, bread and water for refusal of labor, 1 day's loss of meal for speaking at table. Each incident entered into its place, numbered and signed. There was no malice in the process, no pity either. It was administration, the modern virtue of efficiency, rendered in script. The poor law authorities in London were exacting about such matters. Annual inspections ensured compliance, and any irregularity could draw reprimand. The books were meant to prove that the system worked, that order had been achieved, that morality had been maintained. The commissioners rarely saw the faces behind the names. For them the ink was enough. Sometimes when epidemics swept through the wards, typhus, cholera, smallpox, the clerk's work became frantic. Deaths multiplied faster than entries could be made. Lines filled in thick succession: deceased, age 6, deceased age 43, deceased cause fever. The handwriting even then remained neat, the pages filled with the quiet monotony of loss, written as though loss itself could be measured. When the epidemics ended, the pace slowed again. New admissions replaced the dead. The ledgers grew heavier year after year, until they seemed to contain the entire rhythm of the institution, its arrivals and departures, its punishments and pardons, its quiet births and quieter deaths. Visitors to workhouses often noted the tidiness of these records. Inspectors described them approvingly in their reports. The books are kept in admirable order, all entries duly made, all signatures complete. To them this was evidence of success. The poor properly managed, the clerks diligent, the system functioning. Few stopped to consider the oddity of such beauty. that in a world of misery, the handwriting of suffering could be so graceful. Occasionally, a note would break the pattern. A brief sentence written in haste or frustration. Run away, refuse to work. Died suddenly. These fragments scattered through the pages hint at the chaos that order sought to contain. The clerk did not embellish. He did not write why a man fled, or how a child died. His duty was only to record, not to understand. The record books became, in time, the only reliable witnesses of workhouse life. When the buildings were demolished in the early 20th century, when the walls came down and the yards grew over with grass, these ledgers survived in archives, dry, silent, immaculate. Historians now leaf through them with careful hands, reading the past not through stories but through script. The pages whisper the same lesson the poor law once taught, that bureaucracy can outlast memory. Within the workhouse itself, few inmates ever saw the books. They existed behind doors they were not allowed to open, kept on shelves they would never touch. To them, the records were invisible, yet their lives unfolded according to them. A misplaced entry could delay release. A forgotten note could erase identity. The clerk's pen determined, in small ways, the rhythm of their existence. There was something almost sacred about the routine. Every evening before extinguishing the lamp, the clerk would close the day's volume, blot the ink, and align the corners of the page. He would then place it neatly atop the others, spine outward, label visible. Each book was numbered. Year 1841, year 1842, year 1843, as though time itself were being bound. Then he would sit for a moment, listening to the muffled quiet of the building. Outside, the wind might stir the courtyard dust. Inside, the ledgers sat motionless, containing everything and nothing. The beauty of the handwriting did not redeem what it described. It only made the system appear serene. Each death looked orderly, each punishment rational, each suffering justified. The poor became symmetrical, their pain archived into neat geometry. If the laundry was the workhouse's sweat, and the stone yard its muscle, then the office was its brain, precise, tireless, indifferent. Here, compassion was replaced by calculation, mercy by measurement. Even grief, when recorded, lost its shape and became a line. When the clerk left for the night, he locked the door behind him. The books waited in the dark, the ink drying slowly, the words fixed forever. In the silence, they seemed almost alive, breathing faintly through the dust, whispering the weight of 1,000 forgotten names. The stillness of the workhouse could not last forever. For decades, the record books stood as proof of order, lines of ink that convinced officials everything was as it should be. But ink, however neat, could not contain the smell of decay. Beneath the arithmetic of reform, rot was spreading, quiet at first, invisible behind walls, until voices began to speak from within and from without. It began with rumors, whispers from servants, parish visitors, and dismissed clerks. A child dead from neglect, a woman starved in the infirmary, a man beaten for refusing to break stones. Such things had always happened, but now they began to reach the ears of those who could write. The Victorian age was the age of print, and print could turn whispers into weapons. By the 1840s, newspapers had become the conscience of the urban crowd. Editors discovered that the public, long indifferent to the poor, could still be stirred by stories of cruelty. If those stories were told vividly enough, the Times, the Illustrated London News, and other dailies began to publish accounts that pierced the veil of administrative serenity. The word workhouse began to change its meaning. Once it had signified order and reform. Now it began to smell of scandal. Journalists and reformers, like the fiery Thomas Wackley, coroner, editor, and founder of the Lancet, took it upon themselves to expose the dark underside of the poor law. In 1846, Wackley sent medical investigators into workhouses to report on the treatment of the sick. The findings were brutal: overcrowded wards, dying patients left unattended, the stench of infection rising from unwashed sheets. Doctors were often untrained, nurses unfit for service, and medicines locked away to save cost. The Lancet's Workhouse Infirmaries reports, published in the 1860s, shocked polite society. Readers who had never set foot in a pauper ward were suddenly confronted with vivid detail: vermin-infested bedding, patients fed on scraps, corpses left unburied for days. It was said that in some houses, lunatics were chained. In others, infants shared beds with the dying. The bureaucratic beauty of the record books now appeared as something sinister, a mask hiding institutional cruelty. Public outcry followed, though slowly, as outrage competed with apathy. Many preferred to believe that the poor deserved their misery, that the tales were exaggerated, but there were too many stories, too many dead, too many inspectors willing to confirm what had been printed. The Poor Law Board, uneasy under pressure, began to send out special investigators. These inspectors, often men of rigid character and somber dress, travelled from union to union with notebooks in hand. Their duty was to observe, to interview, to document, yet even they could not remain untouched by what they saw. In one London workhouse, an inspector found elderly inmates sleeping three to a bed, the straw beneath them damp and sour. In another, he recorded that a child's body had been left unwashed in the dead room for 2 days, because no one had time to prepare a coffin. Meals were weighed to the ounce. Any complaint was recorded as insubordination. The master's wife might rule the women's wing with cruelty disguised as piety. The matron might withhold rations to enforce obedience. Each report that reached London added another crack to the facade of order. Parliament could no longer ignore the murmur. Committees were formed, testimonies taken. Yet the machinery of reform turned slowly, grinding through procedure. For every outrage exposed, 10 more remained unseen. Among the most infamous scandals was that of Andover Workhouse in 1845, the one that broke the silence. There, starving men employed in crushing bones for fertilizer had been caught gnawing the marrow from the refuse they were meant to process. The revelation horrified the nation. The official inquiry that followed uncovered years of neglect, corruption and brutality. The master and matron were dismissed. The Board of Guardians dissolved. The Andover scandal became a symbol, proof that the system designed to deter poverty had instead institutionalized it. After Andover, inspections intensified. The Poor Law Commissioners themselves came under scrutiny, accused of ignorance and complicity. The language of reform shifted, no longer about discipline, but about humanity. Yet for those inside the walls, little changed overnight. The stones remained cold, the bells still rang, the porridge still thin, only the air seemed different, as if the outside world had finally remembered that the poor existed. By the 1870s, investigative journalism had become an art. Writers like Henry Mayhew, through his London Labour and the London Poor, gave faces and voices to those who had been reduced to numbers. Though his work extended beyond the workhouse, it captured the moral atmosphere of the time, a society learning, awkwardly, to see its own reflection in the suffering of others. Some inspectors became reformers in spirit, if not in speech. They began to write differently in their reports. Not only the facts, but the feelings behind them. The wards are clean, one noted, but the faces within them are not happy. It was a small rebellion against the cold detachment of the old bureaucracy, a quiet acknowledgement that order was not the same as mercy. Religious organizations and philanthropic visitors also began to enter the workhouses, their presence both helpful and intrusive. They brought prayer books, blankets, sometimes food, but also judgment, sermons and records of their own. The poor became subjects of pity instead of punishment, and yet pity too could wound. It reminded inmates that their lives were objects for others to observe and measure. As the century wore on, new scandals emerged: the mistreatment of children, the neglect of the insane, the misuse of funds. Each brought another wave of outrage, another promise of reform. But the structure itself, the division of the poor from the world, remained firm. The workhouse had become too much a symbol to be easily undone. The inspections continued, regular as clockwork. Inspectors arrived unannounced, their footsteps echoing down the corridors. The masters stood rigid, the matrons silent. Registers were opened, keys presented, beds uncovered. The visitors peered into the infirmaries, sniffed the air, examined the bread. Their notes were brisk, satisfactory, clean, adequate. Only occasionally did they add a sentence that trembled. The old woman in bed 14 appears near death. The child in ward 3 asked for her mother. When they left, the gates closed behind them, and the rhythm resumed. The poor remained, and the books filled on. But something irreversible had begun. The public could no longer pretend the system was merely administrative. The workhouse was no longer invisible. Its name, once associated with order, now carried a stench of cruelty. The balance had shifted from secrecy to scrutiny, slow, imperfect, but real. The greatest irony was that the same bureaucracy that had concealed suffering also preserved the evidence of it. The ledgers, reports, and minutes that once justified the system now served as proof of its inhumanity. Every page signed by a master, every note by an inspector, every complaint filed and ignored, all became part of the record that would one day condemn the institution itself. And so, beneath the weight of scandal and inspection, the workhouse began to change. Not in its walls, not yet in its rules, but in the way it was seen. The silence was broken, the ink had begun to speak. By the time the reports and scandals of the workhouses reached the public eye, a quiet storm had begun to gather among those who held pens instead of ledgers. In the calm parlours and smoky studies of Victorian Britain, writers, philosophers, and reformers began to speak of poverty not as a failure of character, but as a wound in the structure of society itself. Their words, printed and circulated in millions, reached places that no inspector's notebook ever could. The workhouse, once a matter of policy, became a symbol. It no longer stood merely as a building of stone and rule, but as a reflection of what Britain feared most about itself, a nation of industry, progress, and empire, built upon foundations of silent suffering. Among those who gave this suffering a voice was Charles Dickens. His childhood had brushed too closely against the grim edges of poverty. His father's imprisonment for debt and his own experience in a blacking factory left an imprint that never faded. When Dickens began to write, he drew not from imagination but from memory. In Oliver Twist, 1837-1839, the workhouse appeared not as a distant institution, but as a living engine of cruelty. "Please, sir, I want some more." The plea of a child became an indictment of a nation. Dickens' description of the poor was not sentimental. It was weary, precise, and deliberately ordinary. His London was not a stage for heroism, but a maze of hunger and indifference. Through him, the reading public, middle class, educated, and mostly untouched by want, saw for the first time what reformers had long whispered, that the poor were not lazy but trapped, not wicked but unwanted. In Bleak House 1853, Dickens went further, turning his pen toward the machinery of law and governance. The fog that crept through the streets of London in that novel was more than weather. It was the moral atmosphere of bureaucracy, thick, obscuring, and endless. The workhouse was only one part of that fog, but it was its densest corner. Dickens' voice was not calm, it was relentless. Yet beneath the rhythm of outrage, there was something slow and heavy, like the steady ticking of a clock marking time until the inevitable change. While Dickens reached the heart, others appealed to the mind. Thomas Carlyle, philosopher and social critic, stood apart from sentimental reform. He looked upon industrial England and saw a world where material progress had outpaced moral progress, where steam engines advanced while souls withered. In his Past and Present 1843, Carlyle used the medieval monastery as a moral counterpoint to the modern factory and workhouse. In his view, the monks of old had labored for community and spiritual purpose, while modern workers and paupers alike labored for nothing but survival. Carlyle's prose thundered, but its cadence was that of lament rather than revolution. The workhouse, he wrote indirectly through his imagery, is the symbol of a society that has forgotten to care. His vision was austere and paternalistic. He did not call for equality, but for meaning, for the restoration of duty and compassion in public life. To him, the poor were not numbers to be managed, but fellow souls adrift in a mechanized age. Between Dickens's empathy and Carlyle's moral philosophy stood Edwin Chadwick, a man of detail, precision, and reforming zeal. Chadwick had served as a commissioner under the 1834 Poor Law, and his belief in rational efficiency helped build the very system that would later come under fire. Yet even within his rigid logic lay the seed of compassion. He believed that poverty could be alleviated through sanitation, through health, through cleanliness. It was a belief that the body could be saved where the spirit had been neglected. Chadwick's report on the sanitary condition of the labouring population 1842 revealed that disease and filth, not moral weakness, were the true engines of destitution. His work led to the creation of public health boards, sewers and clean water systems, not acts of mercy but acts of management that nonetheless saved lives. His reforms, though bureaucratic, softened the edges of the workhouse world. Cleanliness became the new charity. Yet Chadwick remained haunted by his own contradictions. He believed in deterrence, that conditions for the poor should never outshine those of the lowest labourer, even as he fought to make those conditions less fatal. His reforms improved the environment, but not the system of separation that underpinned it. The workhouse still divided families, still measured compassion in ounces of gruel. Through the mid-19th century, the triangle of these three men, Dickens, Carlyle, Chadwick, defined the moral conversation of Victorian England. Each spoke from a different angle, yet their words formed a strange harmony. Dickens made the poor visible, Carlyle made them meaningful, Chadwick made them manageable. Together they reshaped the national conscience. Beyond them, others joined the slow chorus of critique. Elizabeth Gaskell, in Mary Barton, 1848, and North and South 1855, offered portraits of working-class life that blurred the boundaries between sympathy and observation. Her factory towns were neither purely tragic nor heroic, but simply human. Her quiet tone, observational, unhurried, precise, mirrored the very rhythm of the industrial age she described. The influence of these reformers was gradual but profound. Newspapers began to report on poverty, not only as scandal, but as social failure. Illustrated weeklies printed sketches of ragged children and overcrowded streets. Missionaries, doctors, and charitable societies found new purpose. Workhouses could no longer be defended as instruments of efficiency. They had to justify their morality. The mid-century debates in Parliament grew less about punishment and more about reform. The language changed. Indolence gave way to destitution. Charity became relief. Small words but heavy ones. Even Queen Victoria herself, influenced by these voices, expressed unease at the cruelty reported in the press. The image of the poor began to shift from threat to victim, from burden to responsibility. Yet change, like everything in Victorian Britain, moved with deliberate slowness. The system that Dickens had condemned still stood for decades after his death. The buildings remained, the bells still rang, the ledgers still filled, but now, the air inside them was different. Visitors came more often, questions were asked, inspections grew warmer, less mechanical. Compassion had begun to seep through the cracks of discipline. By the final decades of the 19th century, a new generation of reformers, inspired by the words of those earlier voices, began to envision alternatives: charity schools, municipal housing, outdoor relief, and old age pensions. The workhouse was no longer seen as inevitable, it was seen as an anachronism. Its stones were still cold, but their purpose was beginning to thaw. Outside in the growing cities, the poor continued their endless routines of survival, but now, their faces appeared in novels, newspapers, and speeches. They had become part of the national imagination. The silence that once defined them had been broken, not by protest or rebellion, but by the slow persistence of words. And as Britain drifted toward the close of the century, the tone of those words softened even further. The outrage cooled into reflection. The critics became historians, the scandals became lessons, and the workhouse, once the symbol of moral failure, began its long, slow transformation into memory. By the final decades of the 19th century, the workhouse had begun to lose its certainty. Its walls still stood, its bells still rang, but the purpose that had once filled it with authority had started to thin like mist under sunlight. What had been a structure of fear and necessity was slowly becoming a relic, useful only because no one yet knew what to replace it with. The Industrial Revolution, that restless engine that had built both wealth and want, was now transforming the very conditions that had once justified the poor law. Railways stretched across the country like veins of iron. Cities had grown vast and complex, full of wages, factories, tenements, and opportunity. Poverty did not disappear, but it had changed its shape. The destitute were no longer only the rural poor displaced by enclosures or harvest failures. They were the urban labourers, the widows of dock workers, the aged and infirm who had once served industry's needs and were now left behind. By the 1880s, new ideas were circulating among politicians and economists. The concept of poverty as a moral flaw had begun to lose its grip. Statistical studies, those quiet revolutions of numbers and ledgers, began to show that most paupers were not idle but trapped by circumstance, illness, widowhood, unemployment, and age. It was not character that failed, but opportunity. The local government board, which had replaced the old Poor Law Commission, started to see that the system was unsustainable. The workhouse, built for deterrence, could not serve as a hospital, an asylum, and a home for the elderly all at once. Yet it had become precisely that. Inside its walls, the population had changed. The young and able-bodied, the very people the system had been designed to discipline, were now few. Instead, the wards were filled with the aged, the chronically ill, the disabled, and the unwanted. Inspectors noted the transformation in their reports with quiet resignation. The character of the inmates, one wrote in 1888, is no longer that of idleness, but infirmity. Another observed that the workhouse has become in effect a refuge for those who can no longer labour, and who have no kin to care for them. What had begun as a place of punishment had softened, almost by accident, into a poor man's hospital. Outside the walls, political winds were shifting. The expansion of democracy, slow, uneven but real, meant that the poor could no longer be entirely silenced. The Reform Acts of 1867 and 1884 had extended the vote to portions of the working class. With representation came the faint stirrings of dignity. Politicians began to realize that the language of deterrence no longer resonated with a public that saw itself, however precariously, as part of the national body rather than its burden. Meanwhile, the rise of trade unions and mutual aid societies gave workers their own networks of support. Friendly societies offered small pensions, sick pay, and funeral funds. What had once driven men and women into the workhouse, illness, unemployment, hunger, was now being addressed, however imperfectly, by collective self-help. The state's harsh paternalism was slowly being replaced by community solidarity. In literature and art, the image of the workhouse shifted once again from a contemporary scandal to a historical symbol. Painters depicted its corridors as places of faded light and weariness. Writers invoked it as a warning from a crueler age. Even Dickens, long dead by then, was being remembered, not as a radical but as a moral chronicler of an era that was ending. Philanthropic organizations grew stronger and more organized. The Charity Organization Society, founded in 1869, promoted a scientific approach to aid, separating the deserving from the undeserving poor, still echoing the old logic of the poor law, but with gentler phrasing. Religious missions, meanwhile, extended relief to those outside the system: soup kitchens, shelters, and schools. They were imperfect, inconsistent, and sometimes judgmental, but they represented a new kind of moral landscape, one that no longer assumed suffering was divine punishment. Inside the workhouse walls, change came in fragments. Infirmaries were gradually separated from general wards, their management turned over to doctors rather than masters. The London workhouses, vast and overcrowded, were among the first to adapt. Some were converted into public hospitals. Their names changed but their stones the same. Others remained half empty, haunted by the echo of footsteps that no longer came. The poor law itself began to decay through neglect, rather than reform. No great act of Parliament abolished it outright. It simply withered as new structures grew around it. The Education Acts of the 1870s took children out of the workhouses and into schools. The Public Health Acts improved sanitation and reduced disease. Pensions and unemployment insurance, still distant ideas in the 1890s, were already being discussed in earnest. The shift was slow, measured, and deeply Victorian in its restraint. The British state, cautious by design, preferred evolution to revolution. It did not tear down the old system. It built around it until the structure itself became redundant. By the turn of the century, many workhouses stood half empty. The poor no longer entered in great numbers. Some came out of habit or hopelessness. Others because there was nowhere else. The guardians still met. The ledgers were still kept, but their entries grew thinner. What had once been the machinery of social control now functioned as little more than a relic of administration. Visitors to these fading institutions described a strange stillness. In some, entire wards were closed off. In others, only a few dozen inmates remained, most of them elderly, sitting in the same long rooms, where generations before had eaten in silence. The discipline remained, but the fear had gone. There was resignation now, even gentleness. The cruelty had not vanished, but it had lost its vigor. The public had turned its gaze elsewhere, to the empire, to technology, to the dawning century. The workhouse belonged to the past now, even as it continued to exist. It was a moral fossil, a reminder of a time when poverty had been treated as a disease to be quarantined, rather than a wound to be healed. Reformers continued to speak, but their tone had changed. No longer demanding the abolition of the workhouse, they spoke of modernizing relief, of dignity in age, of social insurance. The conversation that had begun with Dickens and Chadwick was now being carried on by men like Seabohm Rowntree and Charles Booth, investigators who used statistics and field studies to reveal that poverty persisted not because of sin, but because of structure. Their surveys of York and London, published around 1901, showed that up to 1/3 of urban families lived in conditions barely above destitution. It was not moral failure, it was economics. These revelations finally broke the intellectual spine of the old poor law. If poverty was systemic, deterrence could not cure it. The workhouse had no moral justification left. Yet even as this truth settled into public consciousness, the stones remained. Bureaucracies, like buildings, do not fall easily. By the eve of the First World War, the word workhouse had begun to disappear from official language. In many regions, they were renamed public assistance institutions. Some were quietly converted into hospitals or care homes. Others stood abandoned, their gates locked, their yards overgrown with weeds. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 had once sought to organize poverty with precision. Now it was itself a historical artifact, and so the system unraveled, not with protest, but with quiet exhaustion. The same calm that had once concealed cruelty now attended its decline. The machinery slowed, its cogs worn smooth by decades of routine, until there was nothing left for it to do. The age of the workhouse was ending. What replaced it was not mercy, not entirely, but something more bureaucratic and less cruel. The early shadow of the welfare state. The idea that the poor might be citizens rather than inmates, that help might be a right rather than a punishment, was still fragile, but it had taken root. The bells still rang, but their sound no longer commanded fear. They marked instead the closing of an era. By the 1920s, the workhouse no longer frightened anyone. It stood like an old fortress in a modern world, its walls discolored, its purpose forgotten even by those who still entered its gates. Trains thundered past fields that had once bred paupers. The factories that had fed and starved the poor now produced machines for a world recovering from war. The old order had not been overthrown, it had simply been outgrown. Inside the workhouses, the population had aged beyond the system itself. There were no more able-bodied inmates, no more overseers shouting orders, no more children lined in rows. What remained were the remnants of a generation, the old, the infirm, the unwanted, living quietly in rooms where rules still existed, but were rarely enforced. The tone had softened into something almost tender, if only because no one cared enough to be cruel anymore. After the First World War, Britain found itself exhausted. Empires had cracked, economies strained, and grief lay heavy on the land. Nearly every family had lost someone, father, son, brother. In such a landscape, the old distinctions between the deserving and undeserving poor seemed petty, almost obscene. Poverty was no longer a moral question, it was a national condition. The war had changed the relationship between the people and the state. Soldiers who had fought in the trenches and returned wounded could not be treated as failures. They had given their strength to the empire, and now the empire owed them something in return. The government began to build a rudimentary welfare structure around them: pensions, medical care, housing schemes. And in doing so it quietly undermined the last moral justification for the workhouse. Still, the buildings persisted, sustained by habit. Guardians still met, clerks still wrote in ledgers, and the old poor law still existed on paper. But its language sounded archaic, like scripture from a forgotten religion. Reports from the early 1920s described a system running on inertia. "The workhouse remains," wrote one inspector, "but its heart has gone out of it." It was the Local Government Act of 1929 that finally put an end to the name, if not the memory. The Act transferred the responsibility for poor relief from the old boards of guardians to county and borough councils. Overnight, the administrative foundation of the workhouse system disappeared. What had begun in 1834 as a grand social experiment ended not with protest nor applause, but with a shuffle of papers. The Act's architects, perhaps unintentionally, consigned the word workhouse to history. The buildings did not vanish. They were too solid, too useful for that, but their names changed. They became public assistance institutions, or simply infirmaries. The paupers became patients, the inmates residents. The transition was linguistic before it was moral, yet words mattered. For nearly a century, the word workhouse had meant punishment, shame, degradation. Now it was being erased, its meaning diluted until only the walls remembered. Many of these former workhouses were absorbed into local hospital systems. Their infirmary wards, once secondary to the main institution, became its heart. In London, Liverpool, Manchester, and Leeds, the conversion was almost seamless. The sick had always been there, after all. In rural areas, the transformation was slower, more reluctant. Some counties lacked the funds or the will to change. In these places, the old routines continued in miniature: meals at fixed hours, curfews at dusk, rules still pinned to doors, no one read anymore. Visitors in the 1930s described these places with a peculiar nostalgia. "It is as though time has stopped," wrote a journalist in 1931, after touring a converted workhouse in Kent. "The people sit in silence, the smell of disinfectant clings to the air, and outside the motorcars pass by without noticing." The new world and the old had begun to overlap, but not to touch. For the elderly who remained, the workhouse's slow transformation brought little comfort. Many had spent their entire lives inside those walls, first as children in the orphan wards, then as laundry girls, cooks or porters, and finally as inmates once more in old age. The institution had been their home, their workplace, their world. To them the renaming meant nothing. The iron bedsteads were the same, the soup was the same, and the loneliness was unchanged. Yet in a broader sense, the nation had moved on. The debates that once filled newspapers and parliament about pauperism had been replaced by new anxieties: unemployment, industrial decline, housing shortages. The Great Depression brought hunger and despair, but it was not the same hunger that had haunted the 1830s. There was now a faint sense, barely conscious, that the state bore responsibility for its citizens' welfare. Poverty was to be managed, not punished. When the Second World War arrived, it finished what the 1929 Act had begun. Bombs fell on cities where workhouses once stood, and many were destroyed outright. Others were requisitioned for military hospitals or evacuation centers. The last vestiges of the poor law disappeared into the machinery of wartime administration. By the war's end, the nation that emerged was fundamentally different. In 1948, the creation of the National Health Service absorbed the final remnants of the workhouse system. The old infirmaries became NHS hospitals. The wards where paupers had once died nameless now bore official plaques and sterile white paint. The transition was quiet, bureaucratic, complete. 100 years of institutional history dissolved into the modern welfare state. For those who had lived through the change, there was little sentimentality. Few mourned the workhouse, most simply forgot. The silence that followed its end was not triumph but fatigue. Britain in the mid-20th century was a nation rebuilding itself, looking forward, not back. The old red brick buildings remained, often hidden behind new facades, their past unspoken. Yet the ghost lingered in language, in policy, in instinct. The stigma that once surrounded poverty did not vanish with the institutions that embodied it. For decades, the phrase "going to the workhouse" survived as a warning whispered by the elderly, a memory of fear inherited by those who had never seen its walls. Even today, some hospitals and care homes still occupy the same ground where those walls once stood, their corridors following the same grim geometry. And so the workhouse did not end with revolution or repentance. It ended with neglect. Its passing was neither victory nor defeat, but a fading, a slow retreat into bureaucratic irrelevance. The machine of moral control wound down not because conscience demanded it, but because time made it unnecessary. By the time historians began to study it in earnest, half a century later, the workhouse was already half myth. Its cruelty seemed distant, its discipline absurd, yet its legacy lay everywhere, in welfare offices, in hospitals, in the quiet assumption that poverty could be managed by administration. The form had changed, but the impulse to contain and classify the poor had not entirely died. Still, compared to what had come before, this was progress. Imperfect, unplanned, almost accidental, but progress nonetheless. The workhouse, that grim cathedral of the poor law, had done its final duty. It had shown the nation what it never wanted to be again. Long after the last workhouse doors closed, its presence lingered, not in buildings or statutes, but in memory. The poor law system had imprinted itself upon the national psyche so deeply that even when its walls were torn down, the silence it created remained. Families who had once been separated by its iron routine did not always find their way back to one another. Time had moved on, but the emotional architecture it built, shame, restraint, obedience, continued quietly through generations. The division of families had left marks that statistics could not measure. The children raised within the workhouse often carried that upbringing into adulthood, not as conscious recollection but as instinct. Many learned to be deferential, to apologize before speaking, to measure worth by labor. They became domestic servants, factory hands and orderlies, the invisible workforce that sustained Britain's new century. For them, freedom was often indistinguishable from habit. They lived as they had been trained, quietly, efficiently, and without complaint. When the new welfare institutions emerged in the 20th century, they inherited not just the physical spaces of the workhouse, but its moral residue. In the hospitals that replaced them, the same wards were sometimes used, though now lined with enamel beds instead of iron ones. The staff still kept ledgers, still rang bells, still followed routines of order and cleanliness born in another age. The difference was one of purpose, not of rhythm. For the patients lying under white sheets, the air carried a trace of that old discipline, the idea that help was conditional, that gratitude was required. In some parts of Britain, the workhouse buildings stood until the late 20th century, quietly repurposed, yet never entirely transformed. One could find them rebranded as hospitals, nursing homes, or council offices, their facades still recognizable to anyone who knew what to look for. In cities like Liverpool, Birmingham, and London, old pauper wards became geriatric wings in rural towns. The workhouse bell tower still cast a long shadow over housing estates, built from its reclaimed bricks. A few became museums, though even those tended toward quiet understatement. History, after all, prefers its darker corners softly lit. The emotional legacy was more elusive. Within families, the memory of the workhouse was not something passed down through stories, but through silence. Few spoke openly about relatives who had gone in. To admit it was to reopen an old wound, or worse, to invite pity. Generations grew up with gaps in their family histories, the years between census entries marked by blank spaces. Only later, when genealogists began digitizing records, did descendants discover the truth that a grandmother's childhood or a great-uncle's disappearance traced back to those cold walls. In the 1950s and 1960s, as Britain embraced a new welfare state, the phrase "the workhouse" still carried an almost superstitious power. Older people used it as a warning: behave yourself or you'll end up in the workhouse. It no longer referred to a literal place, but to the idea of abandonment, of being forgotten by society. The threat outlasted the institution. Even in the age of social security, housing benefits, and the NHS, that fear remained rooted somewhere deep, the sense that poverty was still a kind of failure, and that assistance came with judgment attached. Sociologists who studied post-war Britain found echoes of that mindset in the stigma surrounding council housing, unemployment and welfare dependency. The language of the undeserving poor resurfaced in subtler forms: whispered judgments about those who could work but did not, those who took without giving back. The ghost of the poor law still walked through public debate, its moral logic repackaged for a modern age. What had once been shouted in the workhouse register, "Relief shall be deterrent," now murmured through policy papers and political speeches. For the descendants of workhouse inmates, this legacy was not always visible, but could be felt in quieter ways. It lived in the habits of thrift passed down like heirlooms, the refusal to waste food, the tendency to hoard small things just in case. It lived in the unease with asking for help, the instinct to apologize for needing anything at all. It lived too in the pride of self-reliance, the dignity of work, the unspoken belief that suffering endured silently was somehow virtuous. The workhouse had taught its lessons well, even to those born long after its demise. Writers and historians of the mid-20th century began to revisit the subject with new eyes. Charles Dickens had once exposed its cruelty through fiction. Now social historians turned to the archives, tracing the daily life of those who had lived and died within its walls. They found not just suffering but structure, a kind of grim order that reflected Victorian values of morality and control. To understand the workhouse, they argued, was to understand Britain itself, its obsession with classification, its fear of disorder, its uneasy balance between compassion and discipline. Museums such as those in Ripon, Southwell and Thetford began preserving workhouse sites in the late 20th century, reconstructing rooms and routines to help visitors imagine the lives once contained there. Visitors walked the long corridors, saw the iron bedsteads and wooden bowls, heard the faint echo of footsteps on stone. The experience was sobering, but strangely quiet. The cruelty was not theatrical, it was bureaucratic, impersonal, methodical. That was what made it haunting. It had not needed villains, it had needed only rules. Yet the memory of the workhouse has never been entirely bleak. For some, it also represents endurance. The people who passed through its gates survived, adapted, built new lives. Their descendants became nurses, teachers, builders, soldiers, the backbone of the country that emerged from two wars. They carried within them a resilience born not of rebellion, but of survival, a capacity to endure the unendurable with quiet strength. The same discipline that once oppressed them later became a kind of moral inheritance, the belief that life could be hard, but one must carry on. The traces of that world linger in language, architecture, and even in law. Many hospitals founded as workhouse infirmaries remained active into the 21st century. Some still bear the same wings and courtyards designed in the 1800s. Their blue plaques now mention their origin briefly, almost apologetically, as if the city prefers not to dwell on it. The past sits just beneath the surface, waiting for those who know how to see it. But the truest echo of the workhouse lives not in buildings or archives, but in emotion, in the quiet unease surrounding poverty, in the moral undertones of policy, in the instinct to separate the deserving from the undeserving. The workhouse may have vanished, yet its language endures whenever compassion is measured, whenever help is offered with a condition attached. And so the story continues, not as history but as habit. The families once divided by law are long gone, their names reduced to faint entries in parish ledgers, but the silence they left behind has never entirely lifted. It drifts through the corridors of hospitals, through the lines at job centres, through the soft bureaucratic language of modern welfare. The poor are no longer punished, but they are still watched. The system no longer condemns, but it still classifies. By the time the 20th century gave way to the 21st, few remembered the workhouse directly, yet almost everyone felt its shadow, an inheritance of restraint, discipline, and unease. The past had folded itself neatly into the present, leaving behind echoes that refused to fade, and in that quiet persistence, the workhouse lived on, not as a place, but as a feeling. When the gates finally closed for the last time, no one noticed. There was no ceremony, no crowd, no proclamation to mark the end of an era that had shaped the lives of millions. The workhouse doors, once the thresholds of fear and necessity, simply fell silent. The keys hung unused on hooks that gathered dust. The wards, where footsteps and whispers once echoed in steady rhythm, grew still. Decades later, the building stood in quiet resignation, their red brick walls darkened with age, ivy crawling over windowsills, iron railings rusting in the damp British air. Rain pooled in the courtyards, where lines of paupers had once assembled, waiting for rations of bread or work assignments. The smell of carbolic soap and boiled linen had long faded, replaced by the must of time, old wood, damp plaster, disuse. And yet, even in that silence, something remained. To walk through one of these abandoned workhouses is to walk through layers of time. Each corridor seems to hum faintly, as if the air itself remembers. The long wards, with their rows of iron bedsteads, retain a strange order, even in decay. The geometry of control is still visible, the symmetrical layout, the watchful central tower, the separation of spaces by gender and age. Every line of architecture speaks a language of hierarchy. Who was allowed where, who could be seen, who must remain hidden. Light filters through tall arched windows, falling in pale columns upon cracked floors. Dust rises with every step, drifting in that light like forgotten thought. There are still faint markings on the walls, the outline of hooks where uniforms once hung, a patch of darker paint where a rule sheet was nailed, the faint ring of wear beneath an old bell. Each trace carries a story, though none are written down. Here the clock has stopped, but the rhythm remains. You can almost feel the daily order lingering in the air, the early bell for waking, the shuffling line to breakfast, the hushed prayers before work. You imagine the sound of the laundry's rolling drums, the scrape of stone in the yard, the echo of footsteps measured by duty. Even silence feels regimented here, as though the building itself still expects obedience. In some rooms, nature has begun to reclaim what policy once ruled. Moss creeps along window frames, small plants push through the cracks in the tiles. The air carries a faint scent of earth and rain. Birds nest in rafters that once echoed with hymns sung half-heartedly on Sundays. The world outside has moved on. Trains run, lights flicker, cities breathe, but here, the 19th century lingers like a breath held too long. It is impossible not to imagine the lives once lived within these walls. The mothers bent over steaming tubs, their hands raw from lye, the fathers out in the yard, hammering stone until their arms ached with futility, the children learning to sew or read, small voices repeating lessons they would never need beyond these gates. Their days unfolded with the monotony of ritual, each moment accounted for, each gesture observed. For the visitor who stands now in the empty corridor, the past feels close enough to touch. The walls seem to listen. Every echo feels like a memory stirring, reluctant to fade. You sense not ghosts but impressions, the persistence of routine, the weight of repetition. There is no horror here, no cry of torment, only quiet. The cruelty of the workhouse was never dramatic. It was procedural, methodical, patient. It wore down lives not through violence but through time, and yet within that quiet lies something else. The trace of endurance, the fact that so many survived this system, endured it, and carried on feels miraculous in retrospect. The workhouse was designed to break the spirit, but it could not erase it entirely. The people who passed through its gates became part of a larger story, a nation's slow, reluctant awakening to compassion. Outside, where the high walls once stood as barriers, there are now gardens and car parks. The gates that divided families now open freely to the street. Children play where paupers once queued, Hospitals operate where infirmaries once confined the dying. The architecture remains, but its meaning has changed, as if the country itself has learned, imperfectly, to turn discipline into care. Still, traces of the old fear persist. The instinct to separate the worthy from the idle, the anxious questioning of who deserves help, echoes faintly in modern debates. Though the workhouse is gone, its moral scaffolding endures in the unspoken assumptions of policy and the quiet judgment of society. The ghosts of routine and hierarchy remain embedded in bureaucracy, in the slow machinery of welfare, in the hesitation before compassion, yet time continues its patient work. Historians, preservationists and wanderers now visit these sites not to condemn but to understand. They photograph the decaying staircases, the old infirmary wards, the bell towers that once regulated lives. They walk slowly, speak softly, as though afraid to disturb the air. What they find is not just the memory of suffering, but a record of evolution, how a nation learned through centuries of error to temper order with empathy. In museums and archives, the ledgers survive, thick volumes filled with neat handwriting, each name carefully recorded. To read them is to confront a kind of intimacy. Each entry, written without sentiment, is the measure of a life contained: births, deaths, punishments, discharges. The handwriting is beautiful, almost tender in its precision, as if those who kept the books understood that even order could be a kind of respect. These ledgers, long after the buildings crumble, will remain the true monuments, a record of millions who passed unnoticed, yet shaped the conscience of a country. The workhouse began as a place to discipline the poor, and ended as a mirror held up to the nation's morality. Its story is not one of villains and victims, but of systems and souls, of intention and consequence. It reminds us that every effort to manage poverty carries within it a vision of what it means to be human, and that those visions can both protect and destroy. Now, as the sun sets behind the red brick shell of a former workhouse, the light slants across its broken windows, and the air grows still. Dust hangs like a veil between centuries. The silence here is complete, not empty, but full. It is the silence of lives endured, of lessons learned too slowly, of compassion discovered through failure. And in that stillness, the story closes not with judgment, but with understanding. The workhouse no longer stands as punishment, but as memory, a quiet testament to how far the world has come, and how far it has yet to go. The gates are gone, the walls remain, the air still holds the faint scent of soap and stone, and somewhere, in the echo of a bell that hasn't rung in 100 years, the past exhales, and finally rests.